And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's fantastic to be here with everyone. It's already a huge crowd, and the good questions in the ideas room are overflowing. As usual, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And, it's amazing all the things that can happen in a week. Of course, last week, yeah.
Keep breathing.
Just remarkable. And, it seems like they have an emergency every other 5 minutes. And I have those news feeds, from the New York Times and the Washington Post in my inbox. And it's just like, they're always amping it up. And I think, I'm someone who's a pretty good screen, having been around that business for so many years. But if you're just an average person getting inundated with this alert system about COVID and stuff, you have to wonder, how much of the amping up is going on. And although we're not talking about that tonight, we did a fantastic interview on that with Dr. Nick Begich. And, Nick's an incredible guy. He's really brought so many things out of the shadows, from 5G to HARP to EMF. And he's really just given us that incredible insight into what happens. One of the main things I think that was interesting that he pointed out is when these Congress people go in for these meetings where they're supposed to get briefings on the kind of things that we're talking about here or about advanced technology, they're not allowed to take notes, which I find very interesting. It's kind of a problem. And so he said the effect is that they go in as kind of like on a 6th grade level and they don't know what's going on. And so therefore these people can put on a dog pony show and then whoosh, they're out of there. And that's what we call oversight. So that's what they do on secret technology. But when it comes to this coronavirus stuff, of course, there's only so many things we can say about it. For sure, it's out of the bottle, and for sure, people are dealing with it. Where it came from is very obscure, I would say, and the official story around that doesn't add up at all. But nonetheless, it's in the arena, and I believe that the only way to get to the bottom of it is to let it play out and to keep an eye on the seizure of emergency powers to get things done. So President Trump called an emergency today to release money to the cities, and you saw the stock market go up, up, up. And that's kind of interesting to me because they had injected from the Fed side $1.5 trillion into the economy also to keep this afloat while this thing is happening. So, I don't think it's good. You see a lot of this on the alternative side to just say, well, it's a hoax or it's a deep state takeover. It has aspects of that. And you can see one of the things I learned from Professor Scott is something called piggybacking. That is, on 9/11, for example, there was a major training exercise taking place across the country about terrorist attacks. And so then you just kind of insert the real thing into one of those and it confuses the system. So what we have here with Corona is something has got out, and there's differing levels of what people think it is, but there's this other thing trying to piggyback on it and sort of test the limits of official emergency powers. How much can you rip up and throw out the Constitution? So they haven't got there yet, but you can see them leaning into that with things like calling out the National Guard and stuff. I think we're going to see, as this gets around, that there's the regular thing of what's happening, and then there's this thing that's piggybacking on it. And that could be for data mining. It could be for a world vaccine. It could be to get everyone into this hype stage, whatever it happens to be. We are keeping an eye on it. I highly recommend the interview with Dr. Begich on that to get a handle on it from a practical standpoint and understanding that's something that we're going to have to integrate and come out of and, really make things better by demanding a better government, demanding less secrecy, demanding constitutional government. That's where I think we're going with this. And so less hype, more on the ground facts, making them more accountable. And so that's going to be the direction for us, as long as they don't throw us off social media.
That is the concern.
Well, there's a lot of censorship that goes on around these things. It's funny because one of the things they did with my Dr. Nick interview is they added this thing about what is the COVID virus?
Right, it's just a CDC note.
Right. Yeah. And it's funny, too, because they do that with my JFK videos. But now they've started doing it on anything that has to do with UFOs. They have, here's the Encyclopedia Britannica of what that subject is. And the Kennedy one is, Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated, and he was a disgruntled Marxist who killed the president. Isn't that a shame? So they're very, they're trying to add this unconscious element that like, oh, this is the official source. I'll go trust that. But we all know that those official sources lie, and this is the nature of the problem with the media and why we get into levels. So I want to reiterate for the beginning of this program the 3 principles of dark journalism. They're simple, they're quick. Here they are. There's the official story. That's always the first thing out. Then there's the secondary story. Researchers, professors, writers poking a hole in that official story and realizing, there's something wrong here. And that's often called the conspiracy theory, but that's just the media trying to get people off the trail. But then under that junk conspiracy. And the junk conspiracy is just as bad as the official story. And very often you'll find the junk conspiracy is put out by the people trying to, keep the story under wraps as a way to drive people back. And they just say, well, that junk conspiracy is too crazy. I'll go back to the official version. So this is what we see a lot of. And it's active in every major story or deep event like what we're seeing roll out here. And the seizure of those types of emergency powers for a health situation are pretty unprecedented. So we'll have to keep our eye on it, but I think it's important to keep those 3 rules in mind as we go. Tonight's episode is X83, and this one is all about deep state plane crashes or flights to nowhere, as it were. And there's so many good examples in history on this. It's remarkable because what we come up against is so many that have happened that have influenced the course of the country that it seems like a favorite weapon of assassination, method of assassination for the deep state. And that's where we're coming from. We're going to be concentrating on 2 plane crashes. One of them is the 1972 plane crash of Hale Boggs and Nick Begich Sr., who was the congressman from Alaska at the time. And of course, that's his son who was on our program, who's talked about this. And it's very brave the way that family has handled the fact that, Nick Begich Sr. went missing in that plane crash along with Hale Boggs. And it took a long time, over a month, for them to declare them dead, because you can disappear in that kind of Alaskan tundra and still survive. And you're going to find some very interesting testimony tonight that, in fact, there were survivors from that plane, FBI reports on that, and also people who were operating ham radio on that night, October 16th, 1972, when this plane went off radar and never showed back up. It was headed from Anchorage, Alaska to Juneau, and it's very interesting, the setup for it. You're going to find some very bizarre things, including the fact that the person who drove Hale Boggs to the airport was a 26-year-old political activist from Arkansas who was trying to make a name for himself. His name was Bill Clinton. Eventually he did make a name for himself, but it's kind of interesting for him to show up under these circumstances. I want to mention that tonight we're going to be taking your questions in the second part of the program. And so ask those all in caps, and Miss Olivia will make something out of that. Before I dive in, Miss Olivia, how are we doing out there?
We're doing okay. I think, in the ideas room, we've got to get past the coronavirus, right? But we're here. We have to, this is one wave that we've got to surf. And there will be other waves coming. And so we have to keep our eyes on the prize, right?
No question. Yeah, and we did address that in the opening. I highly recommend the Dr. Nick Begich interview on that. It'll give you a good grounding for what we're talking about. And, everyone is getting inundated with that, including the president. we need to understand it on a practical level. At the end of the day, they have to be accountable for it and what's going on there. And we have to operate within the confines of the Constitution. In this country, we do. That's just the nature of the beast. So that's what we're going to be looking for, constitutional responses to the crisis. And yeah, very, very interesting. It does play into exactly what we're talking about, though, because so many of these cases, there's a lack of transparency, and that's what we really get into in the X series, is going behind that facade. And you can do that, you know, black ops very often take years and years to unravel. And this is the thing we need to keep in mind. So I'm able to dissect a plane crash in a story from 1972. And I'm able to go back to like 1987 and the Iran-Contra affair and different things of this nature, 2001 9/11 attacks, 2008 crash. The things that happen as they happen are very tricky to get behind because you need things to play out to get behind to see where the sources are coming from. So this is why it's such a useful exercise once we start to recognize the methods that get used for obfuscation, for corruption, for changing stories, for altering narratives. You can find that in the heart of the history of the deep state. And tonight it's deep state plane crashes, because this is something where they've really used this to alter the fate of the nation. Now, I'm going to talk about the figure of Hale Boggs for a moment, but I want to introduce one of the early plane incidents to get us on board with this whole plane crash, flights to nowhere aspect. And what we have to do is we have to put ourselves back into 1961 originally. And President Kennedy is getting a briefing from his Joint Chiefs. And there's some military people in there who are suggesting things to him for getting an edge on this Cuban situation. We'd have all kinds of problems with Cuba at the time, and those problems really never went away through the extent of his whole presidency, unfortunately.
We're still dealing with them.
Yes. Well, now we have incredible sanctions on them, which is really a tough scene on their side. But one of the things that happened was they presented a plan to President Kennedy called Operation Northwoods. And Operation Northwoods is such a corrupt plan. But the idea was the military itself was going to hijack one of our airlines. And they were going to have it hijacked and say that it was Cubans that hijacked it and fly it into a Cuban territory and then shoot it down. And then they had this whole idea about how they would land the plane, take certain people off, and then put the plane back up and have it blow up. This was the plan that they suggested to President Kennedy. These documents came out right around the year 2000, and they tumbled out in the middle of all this, and they had never been seen before that. And so Kennedy was horrified at this plan that they had given him, and he almost threw them out of the room. And he said, "Don't ever present plans like that to me ever again." So he certainly wanted to know covert operations, but not at the risk of American lives or fake hijackings or whatever it happened to be. He was someone who really now had an idea of where he was coming from. And so what took place with Operation Northwoods was we get to understand how military black ops think. That's why when we get into things like 9/11 and we see the inconsistencies there, we see that there are people inside that national security state structure who are willing to win at any price. As long as they're on top at the end of the day, they'll do anything. And that's where the CIA comes in, because that's pretty much their motto. So we see this idea of using planes for deep state operations is on record, and it was rejected by the Kennedy administration, but it was a pretty thought out plan.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So who is actually planning that? I mean, did they have a think tank? Is it the Pentagon? Who is responsible for coming up with that?
Well, they have black operators inside of the military, and they submit ideas to the Joint Chiefs. The Joint Chiefs say, well, I like this idea, I like that idea. Then they sit down with the defense secretary and figure out what to present to the president. Now, McNamara.
So all of these people okayed this plan. They loved it. They thought it was a great plan.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, we have to remember that some of those Joint Chiefs, too, like Curtis LeMay, for example, he was the person in charge of firebombing Japan, which is one of the worst. We were at war, of course, but this is somebody who really attacked civilian centers with intense firebombing. And he was very interested in using the nuclear option in Cuba. And so these were people who were just thinking, we're going to have a nuclear exchange. We're going to be the ones to use them. Now, we learned so much about the nuclear threat, and we negotiated ourselves finally in 1987 to this great treaty, which is fantastic because, Gorbachev and Reagan took it upon themselves to reduce for the first time the arsenals of nuclear weapons, just like Kennedy took it upon himself with Khrushchev to do the nuclear test ban treaty. That means we're not going to explode nukes in the atmosphere and potentially cause a rip in the atmosphere of the ozone. So that's how we kind of saved the world. Unfortunately, under the Trump administration, and I regret to say this, that the Trump administration has taken us out of the 1987 IMF treaty with the Russians, which is a very dangerous thing to do. And they want to apply $1 trillion in renewing the nuclear arsenal, which is absurd since we don't have an actual nuclear enemy, and we all know we're dealing with more advanced nuclear things than nuclear weapons when we go deep into those projects. So we're in a weird space there, and so it's become a dangerous world again on the nuclear side. And that's why you see those scientists moving the clock closer to midnight, the doomsday clock, and all the rest of it. Hopefully we get to move it back. But
it's amazing that any of these people consider themselves smart, brilliant, genius, whatever, that nobody can think past the nuclear option, that it's still on the table is just absurd at this point.
I think they think in terms of advantage, and they're like, we'll have mobile nukes, but really what's happening is military contractors can plan out budgets. And if you have a treaty that restricts the development of a certain type of weapon, then you don't get to make it. So therefore you miss out on all of the realization of these profits. So if you can go in there and create reasons to get out of treaties, to spend money on nuclear weapons again, then, you just roll the dice that they won't get used. But it's a terrible idea. And in response, of course, the Russians have redeveloped their nuclear arsenal, which is much smaller than ours by a long shot. Russia spends, we spend in a month what they spend in a year. I mean, they're so far behind what we do. And when people try to talk about how advanced China is, they spend on a fifth of what we spend on the military. It's absurd. What they're doing now, the Russians and the Chinese, is they're building a bridge. They're building bridges, communications, things like that. And we're stockpiling nukes. So it's a wrong approach. And we've got a $750 billion NDAA, military bill every year for this. And we're technically not even at war with anybody, except that we like to go over to the Middle East and bomb people. So this is a real big problem. And this is something that, you think there's a split between Democrats and Republicans. But at the end of the day, they lined up and signed without any protest the $750 billion NDAA right around Christmas time. So, this is the nature of the situation that we find ourselves in. Okay, so did you say, oh,
the sex bots are back.
It's interesting.
So Gigi caught it though.
It's an interesting thing where there's a lot of spamming going on in the live chat, and that's something that just happens, but we're right on top of it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series episode 83, and we're looking at deep state plane crashes, the disappearance of Hale Boggs. And along this line, we're also going to look at the case of Dorothy Hunt, who was the wife of a CIA operator, super spy, who had become part of the plumbers for the Nixon administration, and her plane going down in 1971. Now, what's interesting when we look at these cases and what takes place, we see that these things happen around political intrigues that give us the door immediately. So I'm going to read a quick list of cases that have come up that really, I would say, are kind of the top cases. And one of the ones I think that comes to mind immediately is Paul Wellstone.
Mm-hmm.
Paul Wellstone's an interesting figure also, who had explored running for president. But he was the Democratic senator from Minnesota, and he had voted against congressional authorization for the Iraq War. And he did it, and then 2 weeks later, just before the election, his plane went down unexpectedly. And Wellstone was that crucial vote against the Iraq War and the authorization for it. Without his vote there, things changed pretty rapidly, and they were able to pass it. So that was a very kind of tough situation they found themselves in, the Bush people trying to go to war. And although we can't say for certain that they were the ones who took the plane down, that's awfully suspicious. Of course, on July 16th, 1999, JFK Jr.'s plane went down, and the host of anomalies that took place with that plane crash, very unusual, including the suggestion that he was going to run for the Senate seat that was going to be up for grabs in the year 2000, and the person who wound up running for the seat and winning it was Hillary Clinton. So if JFK Jr. had been running there, her odds for getting in as just having the background as First Lady and nothing else were not very good. So, eyes did turn to the Clintons because of the massive death list that we have around the Clintons. So when we get into what do you got?
Mount Clever said Hillary did it. What's your opinion?
The thing is, there's no evidence that the Clintons were involved at all. But
it's just suspicious timing.
I think the fact that the deep state removed JFK Jr. is pretty certain. I don't think there's any doubt about that. A highly suspicious craft. And then if you look also at the circumstances with them coming into this senatorial election that was coming up and her needing to get in there to have that springboard to the presidency, it's very unusual. And what's odd and what gives us further indication that JFK Jr. was going to run for that seat is that when the seat was vacated by Hillary to become Secretary of State, everyone had expected Obama to appoint Carolyn Kennedy to the seat. It's almost like, as a given. And of course, JFK Jr. lived in New York at the time, but he was running George Magazine. And the other part of this is that George Magazine had an expose in the pipeline that JFK Jr. had told some people about in relation to his father's death. What happened to that information is very interesting, the trail of it and the references to it, but no, it has never surfaced, oddly enough. So we have definite indications that JFK Jr.'s plane was forced off. The people who've investigated it on the side of just, knowing planes and how they operate and how plane crashes go, find it highly suspicious. And that's kind of the first step, I think, that we take on that one.
David Tormine is asking, wasn't Bill Clinton in charge of the search and rescue when the crash occurred?
The search and rescue for JFK Jr.?
I guess that's what he's asking.
He certainly was president. Yeah, so it was his FAA that would have been in charge. And we're going to get into the FAA tonight because it's a very interesting position, the Undersecretary of Transportation. They get to control the FAA and what kind of resources go into these kind of investigations. We're going to find that they were abused at different times. And I'm going to show you some very unusual people who were involved with the FAA. You're watching the Dark Journalist Show, episode X83. This is Deep State Plane Crashes. I'm going to recommend and remind you to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our newsletter, because you're going to want to keep in touch with us as we're looking at all of these different situations of people getting thrown off of social media depending on the types of ops that are being run, it becomes more and more hazardous to have people like us out here, and doing this kind of work and the type of reporting that I'm doing, just like it's dangerous for them to have like a Catherine Fitz or Joseph Farrell out there, especially since I integrate so much of the material that they work with. So we're all looking at a series of different ways in which they can keep that information out. The best way to stay in touch, sign up for the newsletter. It's free. And what'll basically happen is you'll get a copy once a week on Friday, letting you know what shows and guests we have coming up for you, and all the important things that will be coming up. And this year is going to be off the charts in terms of exciting things that we're going to have in the pipeline for you. Okay, so we've seen that President Kennedy rejected these types of nefarious efforts on behalf of the Black Ops people. And also there were other plans that he rejected, including spreading swine flu in Cuba by the CIA. This was their master plan, that if they could spread swine flu.
Was that in the 60s?
That was 61.
Oh.
I know. And, that would destroy Castro's economy and they'd be all set. So these plans are on the table, and they do have the ability to take them off the shelf and bring them out. Now, what we have in the case of Hale Boggs is Hale Boggs had a relationship with Kennedy. As a matter of fact, he was a lead congressman from Louisiana, and it was a key place because Kennedy had this incredible Northeast appeal and West Coast appeal and some sort of Midwest appeal, but he did not have Southern appeal, and that's where his Nixon won so many states from him. And the only way they hung on was by winning Texas by, not much. So Southerners in the early 60s didn't like his policies, which were very fair on civil rights and very advanced and progressive in this sense, but in a true progressive way, not in the kind of bogus progressive thing that we see now with the idea of progressive supposedly is, I've been trying to come up with a line for this, but it's like, have your transgender baby in prison. It's something along that line. So they love to twist and throw these things around and divide people off against each other. And I can tell you that a lot of, gay people and transgender people don't like to be thrown into that blender of political football, and I don't blame them a bit. So, but we see a lot of this going on around movements that call themselves progressive. They also try to do a lot of race baiting. So, but progressive in Kennedy's era was a lot different because we were in such a standstill with civil rights, and so Kennedy really had that edge going. But he needed Hale Boggs, and they had developed this friendship going on in this period. And the time really, I'm trying to get a good look on that. The time really that we're looking at is 1961, where Kennedy was turning to him and saying, if you can help me pass this stuff through Congress, if you're part of my stronghold in the South, this is going to be good. Boggs himself is a very unusual figure. It's hard to say what force it was that was propelling him, but let's get a few facts on the ground. First off, he was 26 years old when he got his congressional seat. He was, in fact, the youngest congressman at the time ever to be elected at that age. He graduated college at 18.
What?
and then he had a law degree by 21.
Wow.
So, and he'd gone to Tulane, which was, that's one of the top law schools. So it's a very unusual character. And Boggs was very practical. But one of the things that he ran almost as a teenager, but he was getting incredible traction, was against the machine that Huey Long controlled. Huey Long was quite a fantastic character who was running New Orleans, and he was looking like he was going to be able to take on FDR. He had quite, if you think Bernie Sanders' movement was something, this guy had the grassroots, and he was all about, Americans need to do more for each other, and it was kind of had a socialist tinge to it. And there were so many forces pitted against Huey Long that, in fact, he was assassinated in 1935. But this is where you first see Hale Boggs show up. And Hale Boggs is basically a politically active teenager who's advanced, and he's going to finish school at an early age. When Kennedy is assassinated, it's a major shock to the system. And what LBJ does is in assembling the Warren Commission, he's trying to whitewash it. He's trying to get people on his side who he thinks will be on this kind of old boys team. And he's picking them very selectively. The person that he chooses to oversee intelligence leads is Allen Dulles, who Kennedy fired because they wanted Dulles tried to lead an attack on Cuba without Kennedy's authorization. So Kennedy fired him outright, which was amazing because he'd been CIA director since 1953. And so his reign, along with his brother, who was Secretary of State, between the two of them, they kind of ran the foreign policy of the United States. Kennedy sacks him and his deputy. And his deputy winds up being the brother of the mayor of Dallas, who, in some of the tumbling records that have come out of the JFK Assassination Records Review Board, we found out that, in fact, Mayor Cabell was a CIA asset. So the person who planned the entire trip for JFK into Dallas, Texas, where he was assassinaed, was a CIA asset.
Boom!
And he was the brother of the man that Kennedy had fired at the CIA. So things look a lot different. Yes, boom. So when we start to get a handle on this, it starts, to come together a little bit more. We can be like, why did they let him go by this unusual turn and slow down the car and all this stuff? Who planned that route? Well, look to the mayor of Dallas and his brother, who was a CIA deputy director that Kennedy fired. So what happens is, though LBJ, after the assassination, when he's putting together the Warren Commission, it's just to whitewash the public. It's not to get at any of the truth. So, but he has to put certain people on there who have a reputation for honesty. And at the same time, he has to pack it. So he puts in Dulles, who Kennedy fired, to control leads. He has Earl Warren manning the commission. But in fact, they say that Dulles controlled the commission predominantly. And he puts in a series of senators and some future presidents like Gerald Ford. But one of the persons he convinces to be on the commission is Hale Boggs. And he might think, well, Boggs is a Southerner like me. He's going to be able to work with me on this. But an odd thing happened, which was that Boggs started to object to the proceedings. And he started to say, J. Edgar Hoover is keeping information from us, and so is the CIA. And there were a lot of transcripts that were left off the record that were recovered later and came out in these Kennedy document releases that show the back and forth going on. And we see Boggs saying, well, this is ridiculous because this judge has come out and said that Oswald, for example, was somebody who was an asset for the FBI as a snitch. And, there were other rumors that Oswald was working under, on a very secret CIA program. And that's why they left him alone. And they took his name off of the rolls of dangerous people to watch from the Secret Service some 6 weeks before Kennedy was assassinated. These types of things. So Boggs is a very uncomfortable figure to have on the Warren Commission. And he starts to find himself at loggerheads over things like the magic bullet and all the rest of it. It's not adding up for him. And so ultimately, he has to go along with it because it's a cut and run kind of jam it through, do it in 9 months, get it out before the next election kind of report. But he writes in there that he's the only dissenting voice in the entire Warren Commission. That's going to be very important when we come around to 1972 and his disappearance.
He's the only dissenting voice?
He's the only dissenting voice.
Wow.
Yeah. And I think that Boggs, in my opinion, he understood how a political corruption machine operated. Having come up in New Orleans, there's no way that you could miss it. And he started to suspect, being on the Warren Commission, this is what happened. In any case, the Warren Commission would submit their report in September 1964 saying, oh, it was Oswald and there was nobody else involved. And by the way, the CIA didn't do it. And that is Boggs there, right here. And we have a number of figures. That's LBJ and Earl Warren, of course. And if you listen to conversations that are going on, though, and I did a documentary, it's 5 years ago now, but it was called Agent Oswald, and in it I play recordings of LBJ talking to Warren Commission members. And Richard Russell is one of them, and they have this whole conversation where they say, well, I don't believe in the magic bullet stuff. And they say, oh, neither do I. I think there were other people involved. So they didn't believe it. As a matter of fact, one of the people who, put the whole thing together, Earl Warren, said, we won't know the truth for another 75 years, meaning the Warren Commission wasn't able to find the truth. And then Ford, later, when he was pressed, because it had come out that behind the scenes when Ford became president, when he was talking to the French premier, he said, oh, yeah, the Kennedy thing, there were massive agencies involved, and there were, all these different things in the conspiracy that was taking place. So that's what he actually believed. And when he got pressed on that in the 90s, because this was coming out, he said, all the commission ever said was that we couldn't find a conspiracy. We didn't say there wasn't one. We said we couldn't find one. So it was very convenient the way that it played out. But anyway, back to Boggs, he had kind of a bad taste in his mouth from this whole experience. Now, in 1966, Jim Garrison, who's the DA of New Orleans, will take a plane ride with Russell Long. And although Russell Long will tell him all these things about the Kennedy assassination that don't add up, and people will attribute Garrison's rekindling interest in this to his conversations with Long, all the information that Long got, and that is Russell Long, who's the son of Huey Long, who got assassinated back there in 1935. The son comes back. You're going to see a lot of that as we go down the line in this story. But Russell Long got all those details from Hale Boggs. So, and he had supported Hale Boggs' run for Congress and governor. He got in for Congress, but he failed as governor. So now we're starting to get the picture here that all of those details meant that the information that Boggs was getting while on the Warren Commission is not what the public got, and this is what got Garrison into the case. And of course, it's because of Garrison's investigation that we picked up on the whole New Orleans aspect related to the assassination. So you can see now that Boggs is a deep player, and he's somebody who knew Kennedy, and he's somebody who was on the Warren Commission and didn't buy it, and was the only dissenting voice. Years later, Robert Ludlum would write a novel based around some of these things, and he would actually put in the novel, which was put out in 1979. I have the name of it somewhere here. And I'll read it before we're done. But in the novel, he will say, you know what? Basically, Boggs was assassinated because of what he knew about the Kennedy assassination. And it makes a lot of sense because there were a lot of rumblings in 1972 to reinvestigate the case. And this is such a crucial thing for us to understand. So before we go any further, I'm going to read off some dates and some people who were assassinated in this thread of using the kind of deep state's favorite tool, which are these plane crashes. So UN Secretary Dag Hammerskjold, September 18th, 1961. Dag Hammerskjold, who we've included in a couple of episodes now, actually, his mission there in Africa, making peace in the Congo, as the UN Secretary General, is a very advanced guy. This is before the kind of big corruption kicked in at the UN. And he had done things, he even created a meditation room in the UN. And he just had that real vision. And he had worked with peace in space with Kennedy. That plus his work on peace in the Congo were anathema to the deep state. He goes out. Now, oddly enough, the NSA had a recording of the plane that was targeting his plane and shot it down. And of course, when he was found on the ground, he was found with the ace of spades in his shirt pocket. And there are kind of gory pictures of that. Now, they repressed those for a long time. They finally came out. And the official story always was, oh, you know, they landed in the wrong place and crashed. No, they were shot down because he was on a peace mission. And if you look back to those stories, it's very interesting because the story of Dag Hammerskjold, who was assassinated in 1961, is coming full circle as the UN is now forced to re-examine the entire case because of what took place back there. So I think that this is the nature of what we need to do when we unravel these cases. We get enough evidence together, and boom, we get back into the real history. That's what needs to happen with the Kennedy assassinations, and that's one of the main reasons I think why we need to really get the facts straight and move those forward. Because just like the UN case of Dag Hammerskjold being assassinated in this plane crash, the Kennedy assassination needs to be examined. The next one is Dorothy Hunt, and she was delivering money to the Watergate burglars to keep their mouths shut. They'd already been caught, and if they implicated Nixon, then that was going to be the end of his presidency. And in fact, that's what happened. But she was bringing money, and she felt like her husband, E. Howard Hunt, who was a friend of Douglas Caddy, who was a Watergate lawyer and has been on this program many times, she was saying that, you know, she felt like the Nixon administration was really kind of leaving these guys ready to go to prison, and that big deal, they were getting paid off, but they were going to have to do time for crimes that he authorized in Watergate and all the rest. And so the Nixon administration was very concerned about her, and they eliminated her through this plane crash. And the plane that went down there's so many unanswered questions, but before any of those things could be answered, Nixon installed his own undersecretary of transportation, who would really kind of cover this. And as a result, the NTSB and the FAA investigated it and said, oh, it was pilot error or whatever. In fact, the plane was taken down, and some of the people on that plane crash did survive. So Dorothy Hunt and her assassination taking place there was the ultimate kind of message to those Watergate burglars. And in fact, right afterwards, E. Howard Hunt pleaded guilty and went to prison for the crimes of Watergate. Then in this string, if we're looking at time-wise, Hale Boggs and Nick Begich, October 16th, 1972. Now, Boggs is about to break details on the JFK assassination and Watergate. He has indicated in speeches on the floor of the House that he's doing that because he is now House Majority Leader, and he is moving into position to become the Speaker of the House, which is going to put him third in line for the presidency. So Hale Boggs is really in a position where he can do a lot of damage to the Nixon administration and open up a lot of things, because remember, back there, he's part of the Warren Commission. He has that dialed in. He knew Kennedy. He understood that there were problems with what had taken place. So this gives us some indication now when we're looking at it, leading up to the incidents that took place there. So we're going to stop at that plane crash and start to investigate Hale Boggs and Nick Begich. The others, like Wellstone and JFK Jr., we're going to integrate as we go along in this show and in the X series. This is the last shot ever seen of Hale Boggs, and that's Nick Begich Sr. That's also the last shot. That's both of them getting into the car that will take them to the plane that will disappear. Remember, this plane was never found, and it was never confirmed that it was crashed. It just literally, like MH370, vanished. Boggs and Begich had formed a very interesting union, and Boggs was very interested in cleaning up corruption. And part of the things that were yes.
Well, right then and there, I can see why it was
a big problem. Yes, there's no question about it. So I'm going to go a little bit into the actual crash and then get into some of the details around what Boggs was up to. And, you know, before I do that, I'm going to read, this is kind of get us in the groove of what was going on with Boggs there in 1972. Now, for the deep state to take him out in a plane crash, they were looking for opportunities to remove him, and they might have surmised that, you know, just assassinating him would raise a lot of questions considering his background. For him just to disappear was kind of more about, you know, they had a really good opportunity because of Alaska and how spread out it was and how it was not easily accessible, although they did mount the largest search for that plane ever in history, and they didn't find it, which is even more remarkable. They sent out SR-71s, which were our most advanced spy planes at the time, to find it. But was that just for show? Did they already know what had happened to the plane? You're going to see a little bit later that's more like it. So, New York Times, April 6, 1971. Let's keep the time in mind. Boggs demands that Hoover quit. Boggs had gone after the ultimate sacred cow, which was J. Edgar Hoover, who had operated his own kind of fiefdom, and he really had bent the Constitution to the point where it was broken. And he had basically created what Boggs thought was a new Gestapo. And so he decided, well, now's the time to kind of turn the tables on this, because they were starting to bug him, and they were starting to surveil him and senators that he was working with. Now, I'm going to read a little bit from this article. April 5th, 1971, quote, the House Democratic leader Hale Boggs of Louisiana called today for the resignation of J. Edgar Hoover, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I ask that Mr. Mitchell, the Attorney General of the United States, have the courage to ask for the resignation of this man. Remember again, Hale Boggs has been in Congress in some capacity or another since 1941. It's almost 30 years. So he knew, the levers of power there. For him to go after Hoover, he must have had something pretty hardcore in mind. He accused Mr. Hoover and the Bureau of tapping the telephones of members of Congress and of stationing agents on campuses to spy on students and faculty members. He said these were the tactics of the Soviet Union and, quote, Hitler's Gestapo. So he was getting pretty close to the truth. Attorney General John Mitchell defended Mr. Hoover and denied the wiretapping charges and said Mr. Boggs should apologize. So they were deflecting from the administration, but they were worried about him. Mr. Boggs did not elaborate on his wiretapping charges in his speech. An aide said later that the Democratic leader would stand by the statement. What he had found were a series of bugs under his rug, and they were listening devices trying to catch these conversations that they were having. A spokesman for the FBI promptly denied that they tapped the telephones of members of Congress, of course. At a political dinner March 19th in Denver, Senator Joseph Montoya, Democrat of New Mexico, said there is wiretapping on Capitol Hill on the telephones of senators and congressmen. It was an open secret, but it was illegal. So Boggs is saying, hey, fire him or let's do some prosecutions. Mr. Boggs is the first member of the Democratic congressional leadership to demand the resignation of the director of the Bureau. However, several other prominent Democrats, McGovern, Muskie, have also asked that Hoover resign. The way that John F. Kennedy described J. Edgar Hoover was dangerous as a rattlesnake, which that has to be pretty good. When you're president, you think someone's dangerous as a rattlesnake. That's pretty good. Now, here's what's interesting. Boggs' charges drew immediate criticism from House Republican leader Gerald Ford of Michigan. Gerald Ford had also been on the Warren Commission with Boggs. Gerald Ford knows that Boggs knows what he knows. Ford will become president, actually, through this whole process. And it might be that we're seeing a battle here for who's going to be president. And I'm going to explain it this way. Because Boggs was on his way to being Speaker of the House, we know that Spiro Agnew, Nixon's VP, was removed on a bribery charge. And he said he had explosive information, Boggs did, that Nixon was going to be removed. So the person who was the Speaker of the House was going to have to take over the presidency because there was going to be a vacancy in the vice presidential slot and in Nixon's slot. What happened instead was that Nixon, when Spiro Agnew went to jail, appointed Ford. Boggs was dead. Nobody could fight this. And so he appointed Ford as VP. Ford, when Nixon resigns, pardons him, and then they're off to the races. Now, there's a weird twist in this story. So I'm going to get a little bit ahead here, which is that Ford will take on Nelson Rockefeller as his VP, which is a bad idea because
very bad idea.
There's an assassin out there from the Manson gang who had been, furloughed.
Squeaky Fromm?
Squeaky Fromm.
Mm-hmm.
and she was quite an off-balance person, but she tried
That's
to.
a very polite way of putting it.
In San Francisco, she tried to pull a gun on Ford while he was at a public event and take him out, and that would have put Nelson Rockefeller into the presidency. That could have been what was behind this entire process. And Boggs was one of the cogs in that wheel because he was the majority leader, and he was heading to the speakership. So he would have been a major obstacle. And also, he was going to be able to oversee the impeachment process of Richard Nixon. So therefore, he's somebody that they needed to get rid of. So I think that gives us some idea of Boggs' hostility towards the Bureau. Now, he was talking about having information that was going to blow a lot of people out of the water.
Where was he saying that?
He said it in the New York Times. He said it on the floor of the Congress, and he didn't let out what the information was. But he was taking the position that the FBI and the CIA were corrupt. He was talking about reopening the Kennedy case, and he was making references to things that in 1972 didn't make sense to people because Watergate had just happened and nobody knew those details. So he knew he had information on the ground about the Watergate scandal. And so it took 2 years to take Nixon out of the White House for that scandal. But Boggs already had this in hand. So he would have been a major person. Okay, so he is deep state target numero uno now. So here he is talking about cleaning up government. And here he is going to Alaska and forming this kind of tight relationship with Nick Begich Sr. Now, it's interesting with Nick Begich Sr. because Nick Begich was very successful as a first-term congressman up there in Alaska. And he was somebody who had got a lot of things done. And when you look back at that history, you can see that he's a different type of politician. He's kind of a man of the people type. And so the combination of those two was pretty vital. However, in my opinion, Begich was collateral damage on that flight because the target was Boggs, and it just so happened that the flight they were taking was together, as it turns out. Everyone, you're watching the X Series 83. This is on deep state plane crashes, and we're going to go deep here into Hale Boggs' disappearance with Congressman Nick Begich. And as they were flying from our Anchorage, Alaska to Juneau, Alaska, in the middle of the 1972 election. And we're going to be taking your questions in the second part of the program. And Miss Olivia will have those. Ask them all in caps so she can keep track of them. How's it going out there?
It's going great. Yeah, Josh Randall mentioned that the Cessna Boggs was flying in at the time of the disappearance was supposed to carry an emergency locator transmitter per Alaska state statutes.
Absolutely.
So, but it didn't?
Yeah. No, well, they said that it didn't. And oddly enough, though, there are FBI files that the plane was found, which is very disturbing. Let's get a look at this. This is the Cessna plane. Just to give you an idea, this is a portable but efficient plane that they use for short political trips like that. And, they had a pretty good team that day. So the idea of pilot error or things like that are kind of out of the question. There was a pilot who said there was turbulence that day. So, it's not out of the question that something happened with the plane and they had to land, for example. But the idea that they crashed and they couldn't be found will be contradicted by official documents that didn't come out until some 30 years later. So, but it's a good point that all of these planes had to have these little emergency responders on them. And the fact that, it didn't have it and didn't send any signal is highly suspicious. And when they did the investigation on it, it didn't look good. So the plane disappears, but the families haven't given up hope. And one of the things I want to stress is you can imagine the tragedy for both the Begich and the Boggs family around this and for the pilot. and all the rest. And so when we go back to look at it, we're trying to look at it understanding the things that those people went through and that they want answers also. So at a certain point, they sent out the SR-71 to search for it, and they were looking deep, and they weren't getting the kind of answers officially. But behind the scenes, other things were happening. There's another one, Begich and Boggs lost on flight. Again, this is about 2 weeks before the election. Now, oddly enough, there's a series of documents that came forward that showed these three things. One, that there were people operating equipment that was experimental surveillance equipment who didn't want to be identified. But they did want to report that they knew the location of where the plane had come down, and that, according to their information, there were survivors. Now, the FBI on record got these calls, and when they looked into it, it sounded completely legitimate. So they asked the people, can you give us more info, and can you get back to us? And in fact, they did, and they tried to give them a map of where it was. But they said that because, for patent reasons and all the rest of it, the reason they had that information and were utilizing this technology, they couldn't come out publicly and say, we have this. But they did give the information to the FBI. Now, there were 3 ham radio operators who were getting messages from a plane that had gone down on the day, and it was in the same vicinity. And the person on the radio indicated there were survivors. There's no controversy about that. That's on the record. So the question was, if their plane was down and there were survivors, why weren't they ever found with the largest manhunt in history? Obviously...
Oh, I got such a creepy feeling when you said that.
Well, it begs the question, because that means the original plan didn't work to kill them in flight, and that the plane survived, and so now they've landed, and now it's got out to some ham radio operators and this person operating experimental equipment, that there are survivors there. Now what? Now what happened to these people? Because you can bet that if the people who were on the ground saw this, then the people who were tracking it, who had caused it to happen, would certainly be concerned about it also. So why were they never recovered if there were survivors? And also, what happened to the plane? Because the suspicion had always been, oh, the plane went down in the water and there was turbulence, and that's what explained it. That's the official story on it, which I'm going to read here because I have a copy of it. However, these stories of them being out there and radioing for help would contradict that completely. So we're in a different kind of spectrum here. We're in a different dimension. Oddly enough, when the election goes down, they still haven't declared these men dead. They wouldn't until January, actually, officially. But after 39 days, they called off the search. So what we do know, I guess you could say on the record, is that the plane did come down and that there were survivors. That much we know. Yes.
Great question from Catherine Harris. And what happened to the ham radio guys? MIB visits? Do we know anything about that?
No, it's just FBI records that they went and interviewed them, and that their stories were solid and they were real people. There is some controversy about a number, one of the numbers that called in, which showed up later in Watergate transcripts, the same phone number. But we'll move on from that. Everyone, you're watching Dark Journalist X Series 83. We're going deep into the crash that claimed the lives of Hale Boggs and Nick Begich Sr. Hale Boggs, as this figure who had been on the Warren Commission and who was such an opponent of the system and the way it was rolling out, is somebody I think that we need to see in this light of the deep state removing one of their major obstacles in that period. And the other plane crashes around that period, like Dorothy Hunt, for example, operate under the same kind of obscure rules. That is, the crash itself makes no sense. And the idea that in the case of that crash, that also she may have survived the crash and then later been killed. So we have a lot of unusual pieces there. And I'm going to get into some dicey characters who may be responsible for some of this, because we have some real bombshells for you tonight. I'm going to remind you to go to the darkjournalist.com website to sign up for our newsletter. And we've been seeing people thrown off the rolls left and right when it comes to social media. And those types of situations, I have to say, when we get into it, it makes you wonder about the reliability of these systems. So the idea that we can have a direct pipeline with each other, I think, is really the way to go. So let's keep that in mind as we go forward. Go to the Dark Journalist website and sign up for our newsletter. I think at the end of the day, the more I look into the situation, it's going to be groups of investigative reporters, researchers, content creators in a block, working, sharing information, getting that material out. And over here, we're going to have, on the mainstream side, a lot of censorship to deal with. So it's going to be more and more of these circles and these networks, and supporting the work that we do here and others who are doing that important work. And, I have to say, one of the things, as a little aside here, that I've been thinking about as the story has come up about the public health emergency and all this, is just how askew and useless a lot of things in the space of independent media are, and how there are things out there, and there are cults and things of this nature that don't serve our interest in the grand scheme of things. And therefore, I think that we should make our choices in 2020. The standards should be higher, and we should, on our side, be able to hit those standards. And I think on the audience side, in terms of what they support, I think they need to get out and support the good information and material. On this program, I always cite, the work that we do with Catherine Austin Fitz, Joseph Farrell, and others. And, I think we need that as kind of a beachhead in the middle of all this. And the idea of spreading the word around that kind of information, and the powerful, Alana Freeland's work, Dr. Nick Begich, Gigi Young is in the chat tonight. These are the people that are going to help us find the right answers. And it's very important that we line up and support their work, because we can see in situations like the one we're facing, those are the people that are going to be under the most pressure, and they're going to need your help. So let's make sure that we get behind them, get behind this show, and give us the support that we need to really kind of move the ball down the court. Because when it comes to the stakes, we can see with the types of things that are happening, accuracy and transparency in this kind of media is so crucial. And if we're not getting it from the mainstream side, as we know, that's why I got into this business, then we certainly need to make sure that the independent side isn't just a chaotic mess. And that, there aren't galactic ambassadors and other things that are blowing up the scene so we can't get at real truth. And there aren't cults operating, or idea of mass arrests, or going to Gitmo and all that kind of junk. That, once the real smackdown hits, the real 411, then that stuff just kind of fritters away. Those people go running into the background, the Ben Fulfords and all that kind of stuff. And the really bad stuff, because they can't handle anything that's real that's going on. And then they're going to make it into something about them. They'll say, well, the whole thing was to get me, So we see an awful lot of this. And I don't like to spend a lot of time criticizing other people's work. I have to make the point that in the space generally, we're going to have to clean up and really bring forward the best things for people, and they'll have that choice to do it. But I think it's incumbent upon the viewers to get behind the work that's giving you something that's useful. And hopefully, when it comes to this show and the others that I've listed, you get real value out of them. So I guess one of my goals for this year is to make sure that less and less people get tricked into that vortex of, don't worry, those Gitmo tribunals will happen any day now. So you're watching X Series 83. We're going to go deep into Hale Boggs, who was there on the Warren Commission investigating the JFK assassination, which is a crucial deep state event. And we're going to be taking your questions in about 20 minutes, but I'm going to go deep here.
Can I throw you a question right now?
Yes.
Okay, Jason Turner wants to know, is this another version of Permindex?
Well, Permindex is a piece of, Permindex is like Assassination Inc. And so they would be utilized, and those are interests that form a crucial role in the deep state. One of the things that we get into a lot is the Bloomfield papers, which are in the Canadian archives, and some of them have been released, but some of them have not. And this is somebody, Louis Bloomfield, who ran Permindex. So when we think about it that way, I think that we realize, I call these things stealth archives, like the JFK assassination files, like the LBJ letter at his library. We know that they're there, but we can't get our hands on them. So the stealth archives exist, and the Bloomfield papers, which we brought out in November of last year, those are the things that I think we need to bring forward. And they're still, even though they were supposed to come out in 2004, they're still being held. The Kennedy assassination papers and the records, the JFK Records Act from 1992 mandated that everything come out in 2017. And the CIA blocked it, and Trump went along with it. He had the ability to really turn the tables on them there, but he decided it was the better, kind of better safe than sorry approach, I guess. But it wasn't even really his decision, frankly, because it was 25 years later, and the CIA made the pathetic excuse that it could still expose sources and methods. If you're using sources and methods from 1963, then get out of the business, because everybody's busted those codes by now. So this is a very important thing. On October 26, 2017, all those records were supposed to come out. And here we are over 2 years later, and they haven't. They've let out a few things, but all the CIA files, the master files, they still have those. So, basically, I think the trip has been, here's a lot of fluff, and we'll keep this other stuff. But congressionally, they're under mandate, under law, to give us those records. And the more that researchers and the public are quiet about it, the more they're getting bamboozled, basically.
Is anybody suing them to get the rest of them? I mean, isn't that the only thing that we can do at this point, to have them released?
Yeah, well, what's interesting, it's a really good question. Jefferson Morley, who was a former Washington Post reporter, came across information about a CIA agent named George Janides, who is not even part of the JFK Records Release Act, because they didn't know he existed. And he ran the Oswald Project back there. So he independently raised a case against the CIA, and he's brought it to court 3 times, and they've rebuffed him 3 times. But that case, Morley versus the CIA, trying to get those records, is still one of those strange things that's out there, because, in fact, they should submit all that information. This is the tricky thing about the CIA encroaching on the space. And, I pointed out in the case of the TTSA, when we get into TTSA, we're looking at a group that uses the CIA, and they have over 100 years of CIA experience on the executive board. And some people would say, well, they're just a UFO group. Who cares, But the CIA trying to, kind of control that narrative around that. You can see how dangerous it is that the CIA doesn't love to give any information out. And they are the authors of the wall of secrecy. And whenever they're pretending to be transparent, it's because they're trying to spin you with their spider web. So the danger in having a group like that pretending to be the voices of UFO transparency is why those guys even merit any mention on this program. But it is incredibly dangerous, in my opinion, to have the CIA giving us the narrative on something as explosive as the UFO file. So over and over again, we find ourselves looking at the Central Intelligence Agency encroaching into these different areas, controlling history, controlling ideas about consciousness, controlling ideas about the UFO file, anything where they can have the advantage, controlling the media. You know, one of the things that Professor Scott taught me was that when you look at an article and it says unnamed sources say that Americans have gone into Iraq, extracted this prisoner, and so on. The unnamed sources are always CIA. So the CIA controls all of that news feed that we get about things that are happening. So when we hear, oh, there's an incursion against Americans on the border of Iraq, let's go bomb Iran, it's because those types of forces want to go in and bomb Iran. But as we found out with WMD in Iraq, the CIA lies. As we found out in the case of the Kennedy assassination almost 60 years ago, the CIA lies. So you can't take their word for those things. So if the media is taking their word, that means we're getting all of that propaganda junk. That's why we need to cut through these things. Without the transparency, we don't stand a chance of understanding what's actually happening in the world. Yes.
Did you want to put another question?
Sure.
Shamanist Anam Kara wanted to know, was Boggs a mystery school insider?
There's something unusual
about him.
There's something very unusual about Boggs. He certainly is someone who is incredibly advanced at an early age. First of all, a 26-year-old congressman. He was the youngest ever back then. I think somebody younger ran recently and won at like 23 or something. But another piece of this I think that's important is Boggs was also, he graduated college very young, before he was 20. And so when I was looking at those dates, they didn't really add up. I was like, how can you do this? And he wound up going into the Navy after he did all these things, like graduated law school. And, so then he's a congressman, then he's in the Navy. It's like a very interesting trajectory. But I will say that Boggs, his experience would lead him to question what was going on. And I think that we've seen in this. Now, there were some breakthroughs in this case by someone named Jonathan Walczak, who was an independent reporter who took some time to dive in on some of the facts around FBI files. And I've got a really good FBI file here that I'm going to read. But this is just a quick snapshot on what Walczak said about it. 40 years ago, Hale Boggs, a powerful Democratic congressman with a colorful past, disappeared in a small plane over Alaska. The massive search that ensued turned up no leads in the plane, along with the body of Boggs and 3 others who died, remain hidden somewhere in the wilderness. Or do they? Now, to mark the anniversary of Boggs' disappearance, Seattle Weekly made Freedom of Information requests of 8 government agencies and reviewed more than 1,500 pages of documents. Now, there was an incident in those documents that were recorded that I think is going to give us a little snapshot of what was happening with Boggs. First off, it says, in this incident, he was run off the road by an unknown driver in Washington, D.C. in 1970. And he reported it, and he took the license plate, and there was no follow-up on that. But somebody was already trying to get him out in 1970. Now, he talks a little bit about, in these FBI records, there's an anonymous tipster who claimed to know where Boggs' plane had crashed. But here's what Seattle Weekly found out in 2012. Amid hundreds of pages in Boggs' FBI file is a single sheet of information that has apparently never been reported. 11:30 p.m., July 23rd, 1970, 2 years before he disappeared, Boggs was driving in Washington, D.C. when a late model Lincoln Continental forced him off the road. He gave chase and was able to take down a license plate number. No additional information is available in the file, and D.C. Metropolitan Police Department, which investigated the incident, told the Weekly that it could not locate any relevant records. Immediately after Boggs disappeared, the U.S. Coast Guard station in Long Beach, California, received a phone call from an individual who claimed to know where the plane had crashed. The tipster said he had access to experimental electronic equipment, and he provided detailed directions to the wreck. So this guy knew where it was. The FBI apparently found him credible in the records, with one agent whose name is redacted stating his opinion that the source of the aforementioned information is, quote, reliable. Though this tip had previously been reported, Seattle Weekly uncovered new details of the tipster, who described as a white male, 35, and they give his physical descriptions, and that he served in the military. So this guy had the background. The most interesting piece of information is the tipster's phone number, which was not redacted in the UFO file, in the FBI file. The number 378-5243 was provided by the Long Beach Coast Guard station, in the area code 213. So they try to hunt down this number, and this is very odd. A hunt for information on the number 213-378-5243 turns up a solitary reference in an obscure congressional document from 1974. In that record, a report on a congressional hearing that examined the possibility of amending the Constitution to protect unborn children. The number is listed as belonging to Right to Life, which was basically an anti-abortion group that was around at the time. It claimed to be America's first pro-life organization. The address was Palo Verde's Estates, California. This is the number of the person who called in. He was associated with this group. Now, interestingly enough, one of the 12 founders of Right to Life was James Francis McIntyre. He was a Catholic archbishop from Los Angeles who was close to President Nixon. So this is kind of a major bombshell here, because the person who's calling in is calling from the number of Right to Life, and he's got this experimental equipment that he's using that he's able to do this with. And then his phone number turns out to be associated with this Catholic archbishop who is close to Nixon. Another interesting little aside here about Boggs is that he's a Catholic, which means part of his resonating with Kennedy also, we get a piece of that, remarkably enough. Okay, so let's go a little bit further on this. Now, the FBI file shows that agents who interviewed the tipster were advised they should believe that the name is redacted, was involved in a covert-type operation, and it should be suggested that if they doubted the seriousness of the matter, they should contact their principals for further advice. These people who were operating this advanced equipment were obviously operating it for some government agency, the NSA, the CIA, someone. They were the ones who came out as tipsters. And the FBI basically understood that they were working for some government agency. The FBI directed its agents to evaluate whether they thought the source was a spy. Once interviewed, the tipster, according to the report, appeared rational, extremely intelligent, but somewhat strange. Yeah, well, I mean, when you think about the guys who work for those agencies, they can be pretty strange. The FBI file would not record his identity. They let him stay off the record. In the days that followed Boggs' disappearance, several independent ham radio operators, as I mentioned, in Northern California said they spoke with or heard a transmission from someone on the plane after it crashed who told them that, quote, there were survivors, on the record. The day after Boggs vanished, according to the FBI file, a search plane picked up a signal believed to be that of a crash locator beacon for approximately 40 minutes, some distance from Juneau, Alaska. However, search planes were unable to pinpoint the source of the signal. The plane had gone down, it was there, and there were survivors. That's a fact. In addition to Boggs, whose daughter is Cokie Roberts. Remember that, Cokie Roberts from ABC News, that's Hale Boggs' daughter. And Lindy Boggs, his wife, would become the ambassador to the Vatican. I mean, these are pretty big movers and shakers here. In fact, she would take over his congressional seat and run it for 9 terms. Pretty remarkable. And Begich's wife was going to take over his seat, but in the runoff there, someone else ended up taking it over. So here's what we have here. Boggs was run off the road in 1970.
God, Cokie Roberts does look like it.
They have the family resemblance, there's no question about it. And having been run off the road, he had this information, and that's why they were running him off the road. Next, he goes forward and he makes this big declaration, get J. Edgar Hoover out of the FBI. He's using Gestapo tactics. In the summer of 1972, he will make remarks that make it sound like he knows what's going on with Watergate, and he has information about the JFK assassination. Boggs has to be eliminated. And this is the nature of this plane crash. Now, what's also interesting about the plane crash is that if there were survivors, we are left with the question of what then? Because if you had that massive of a manhunt, they were going to find them. So something took place that obscured their location. Electronic blocking, or they literally went and got rid of the plane and the survivors. Those are just speculations. I have no idea, but certainly something took place. Here's Boggs' quote to give you some idea of why they may have wanted him on the chopping block. Boggs said, over the post-war years, we have granted to the elite and secret police within our system vast new powers over the lives and liberties of the people. Sounds familiar? We're seeing a lot of that today. At the request of the trusted and respected heads of those forces and their appeal to the necessities of national security, we have exempted those grants of power from due accounting and strict surveillance. What he's saying is the surveillance state is out of control then. That's 1972. Look at us now.
That's crazy.
I know.
I mean, what kind of surveillance did they have then?
Oh, certainly. Well, they had wiretaps.
Yeah, big deal.
Well, no, I mean, it's pretty advanced because remember, even though the stuff wasn't public, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. They could tap phones. They could bug lines. They could put things on your windowsill that would amplify any voices that were going on in the house. They certainly had the ability to, change the course of history, but the problem is it's all unconstitutional.
Right.
But it is, yeah, it's pretty remarkable.
Can I throw you a question?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Timothy Mackin wants to know, was Hale Boggs or staff or circle ever a back channel or source to the Garrison investigation? I was thinking that myself. Yeah,
well, what's interesting is publicly Boggs wouldn't support him, but then nobody would because of the things he was coming out with so much. You know, he was saying that the CIA eliminated Kennedy outright. So, and he was putting someone on trial for it. As a sitting congressman, Boggs couldn't get involved in that. But as we know, he had filled in Russell Long with all the details of the inconsistencies around Oswald and how Oswald worked for Guy Bannister in New Orleans. And Guy Bannister was a right-wing infiltrator, former FBI director for the Chicago office. So this idea that Oswald, who's supposed to be this big Marxist communist, is working for a right-wing guy and infiltrating student groups and Cuban groups, that information is kind of the important piece because they couldn't have portrayed Oswald as this crazy communist who wanted to kill Kennedy, which is a ridiculous story anyway because Johnson was way more anti-communist than Kennedy. So there's no good rationale for what they suggest. You know, usually an assassin has a rationale. Even John Hinckley Jr., when they sent him out there mind control to kill Reagan, his rationale is he wanted to impress Jodie Foster. Lee Harvey Oswald doesn't have any reason. The stated reason is that he was a communist and he wanted to get the president. But there's so many things that don't add up for that, like the fact that he worked for right-wing Guy Bannister. Also, what are the odds that a guy like Oswald is going to get a job on the motorcade route 6 weeks before Kennedy is to arrive there. No one knew the route 6 weeks before that Kennedy was coming. So obviously, not publicly. So therefore, he would have to just, walk into a job that was paying him $1.25 an hour to stack books. And it just so happens that within 6 weeks of getting that job, this crazy communist gets the greatest luck in the world. The president's going to go by the window of the job that he got. It's absurd. The whole story was absurd, and also the evidence after the fact. So what do you do with a story like that? I mean, it's part of American history. If you're in high school or grade school and you answer, someone asks who killed President Kennedy, if you don't answer Oswald, you're wrong. So the official history is just completely wrong. But now so many people know it that it's absurd. So they've never known what to do with that. What do? They can't put it back in the bottle, And this is why we've had this tug of war over it, because the main cover-up apparatus is the media, but they're doing it at the behest of the Central Intelligence Agency, because the Central Intelligence Agency had used Oswald, and then at the perfect time, they set him up as the patsy. It's very simple.
So Joanne Dwyer wants to know, how did Garrison manage to not have an accident, in quotes?
Oh, he had many attempts on his life, as a matter of fact. He said that he learned something in doing this case, which was that, so many people being in the killing business who were trying to get him. And then he thought, I have all these protections being the district attorney of New Orleans. Can you imagine the little witnesses who come forward and try to get something going, and having to deal with that? If he didn't have all those protections, he never would have made it. So that's a good question, though. And Garrison's case does go right to the heart of this with Boggs, because it gives Boggs the ability then to start speaking out, because Garrison's case, although harangued in the media, cracks the secrecy, in a crucial way.
I think also it's a good time to bring up the Garrison bathroom incident that shows up in the JFK movie.
Yes. Well, they try to set up Garrison as having like a sex tryst in this bathroom at an airport. And what happened was he sensed that something weird was going on. These guys followed him into a bathroom, and he left, and there were all this phalanx of cops out there just waiting to arrest him. And this guy comes running out, pulling up his pants or whatever, and said, come back to me. So it didn't work, but they were trying to set him up and make him look like that. There are a lot of different ways. As a matter of fact, one of the things that they did with Garrison was they set him up after the trial for what they said was accepting a bribe. And then they had another charge on top of it, which was not reporting the bribe to the IRS. So they had two quotes on him, and they were like, you're going to prison. But the guy recanted his testimony. And so the first charge was thrown out because he wasn't ever bribed. So that was junk. And then the second one was that he hadn't reported the money. Since he never got it, he wasn't in any trouble there. But it did wear him down, because they kept him in court for a year after the fact. And you can notice, if you look at Garrison in 1967, when he brings the case against the CIA and Clay Shaw in the murder of President Kennedy, and then you look at him in 1971 after the fact. If I had before and after photos, I'd show you. But he has taken on the stress of that black ops world. And, that's the kind of sacrifice that he made. And so luckily, in a sense, he was redeemed with the Oliver Stone movie, but he
was totally redeemed.
Yeah, and he has a cameo in it as Earl Warren.
He's great.
You don't get any better than that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We've gone deep on this plane crash, and the most unusual thing about there being survivors after the fact, and that Hale Boggs, who was the leader of the House of Representatives for the Democrats, went down in this plane crash with a congressman named Nick Begich Sr. And we all know Nick Begich Jr. has done remarkable work. Interesting thing about Nick Begich Jr. is his brother was senator from Alaska from 2009 to 2015, I believe. So that family has this politics in their milieu. It's part of what they do. And I do think when we look back at the history of this, we're looking at this strange crisscross of Boggs and what they were trying to do with Boggs, and that Boggs was looking to clean up the government. And this is where we get into him being eliminated, and then the fact that Begich is with him. He's getting eliminated because he's there with Boggs. Yes.
David Donaway asks the question. So was Boggs and his ilk on the wrong side of the Bormann-Reich post-Operation Paperclip and the corporatization of America?
Well, there's no question about it. The problem is that the Hoover faction, which Nixon thought he had under control, basically. Interestingly enough, Hoover would die in 73, I believe. And, when he finally died, it was like that whole apparatus came down, because what he would do, it was a very interesting control system. And the former Vice President Walter Mondale described it this way, that a congressman would go to like a party, or he would have a mistress or something. And then the FBI would take all these pictures. And then the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover would send an agent over to the senator's home and say, I need to have a private conference with you. And he would say, look at all these pictures, that party you attended and the strange things that you did and your mistress and all this stuff and all the money you've given her. Well, we took pictures of it all, and I just want you to know that we're aware of this, and if anyone tries to blackmail you about it, you come and let us know, okay? So
damn, you're good at this.
So this is the nature of the beast, and that's how they created something called control files, which we understand now what control files are. But basically, they get photos or video of you in compromising positions, and then they can control you forever. Now, I'm going to tell you a weird story about Hoover. And this is a story that's told by an associate of Robert Kennedy, that Hoover was trying to politically manipulate the Kennedys because of their various affairs and things like that. And that Robert Kennedy was getting these hints from Hoover that he was going to do this. And so Robert Kennedy, it was well known about Hoover that he was homosexual. And when he died, they found all of these women's clothes in his closet. But Hoover who had preyed into everyone's life. He had remained single his whole life, and he had this one lifelong FBI agent, male companion, the whole time. And he just couldn't be out about his sexuality in the period. It wasn't the period, so he was repressed, and he was punishing everyone else about their sex life. Now, interestingly enough, Hoover is making those moves, saying, I'm going to do this, Robert Kennedy, your brother had this dalliance with Marilyn Monroe or whatever. And so this assistant to Kennedy tells the story this way. He says, Kennedy said, ask for a meeting with the director, so you have something to show him. Gives him a briefcase. He says, sit down with him, open the briefcase, have him take a look at it, and then close it, and then come back. And so the guy comes down, he meets with Hoover, he opens the thing, and he closes it, and Hoover says, okay, I understand. And so the ultimate twist in this whole story is they had their own control file on Hoover, and Robert Kennedy was like, if you're going to let that stuff out publicly, you're going to come out as gay because we have all of this material on you. So that's a game that sexual blackmail is played in Washington, and Hoover was a master at it and dangerous. And somehow Bobby Kennedy, in the middle of his Mafia investigations, came across this, because apparently, and the story goes from the assistant, that the Mafia had been blackmailing Hoover for years with this, because oddly enough, Hoover had been caught and photographed by the Mafia in this homosexual dalliance. And so they had that on him. And the whole time through the 40s and 50s, Hoover never once mentioned the Mafia, organized crime. It took Bobby Kennedy to bring those names to the public, because they had all this information that they could do a hit job on Hoover. So that's something to kind of keep in mind when we're getting into Hoover and all the things that he did. Okay, everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, X73. We're going into deep state plane crashes. It's important to look at the methods and means as we go along here.
I'm going to ask you a deep question.
Yes.
This is my question. Clearly, well, I'm going to use the line from JFK, fun and games, man. It's fun and games. How these people all play this high stakes game.
No
That's
question.
what they think life is. But for so many of us, down a little bit lower, that's not how we perceive life at all.
No.
How do we get rid of these people who are controlling our lives as if it's a stupid game?
Well, that is really the question. They operate on these levels, just like when we saw with James Comey and the Russian dossier and all this stuff that they try to nail on Trump. That was a certain type of sexual blackmail also that they were trying to use against Trump. And in that case, it was trumped up. I'm sure they have other things they could use. When you look at the case of Jeffrey Epstein, that is a classic case of how to get control files, invite these people into compromising situations. He has, gobs and gobs of video of them doing all these things on his island, and then you can control the government that way. So this is something that Professor Scott has addressed in his work. And he suggests that the deep state use all types of different blackmail techniques, but that was a crucial one. And that something that was going on with Clinton in the 90s was some kind of attempt to use this. But certainly they've been doing it. I mean, we know that they were doing it with Kennedy, but so many of those presidents going back could have been subject to this also. And one of the things that came up in my interview with Joseph Farrell, which is coming out, which is that FDR, when he was in the Navy, this is fascinating that this came up, but FDR, when he was in the Navy, was compiling information on the sex lives of the higher-ups in the Navy. So this was like, he was doing kind of one of the first control files, and we're talking about 1917, 1918. So this stuff has been going on for a long, long time.
I'm going to make a suggestion, a show suggestion in the future.
Yes.
I think that we should have a show just on this.
Deep state control files.
Well,
yes.
no, about how do we eliminate the 5,000-year domination paradigm that Deborah talks about all the time?
Yes.
What are we? And we can crowdsource it, and we can ask everybody in the ideas room for ideas, because
No question.
we really need to figure this out.
I can see great questions flying around the ideas room. Also, that's a good point, because we're going to take your questions in about 10 minutes here. I'm going to go a little bit deeper as we go to get us really kind of close to the center of what may have happened in this plane crash, and then we're going to go to your questions. It's a fantastic crowd, a huge crowd tonight, and I see a lot of familiar faces out there. Now, speaking of the Mafia and stuff, let's get into something very, very unusual. This is strange, and this is from FBI reports, but I'm going to bring us into a weird period here where someone named Joe Bonanno was the person that they used as the role for Vito Corleone in The Godfather. This is somebody who was really the kind of go-to man. And the Mafia wave there of organized crime, whether you look at people like Jack Ruby or you look at Nixon or LBJ, the Mafia is a big piece of how to get things done. So the Mafia's role is transformed, but it's still there now. It's just they've cut out a lot of the middlemen over the years. But let's find out about Joe Bonanno. He had actually retired to Tucson, and after running all these different mobs, and one of the mobs is the Purple Gang in Detroit. Purple Gang in Detroit had a very unusual member, and this gets into a relationship to this plane crash, because there's a story that this person told while in prison that might give us some hint of what was going on here. and the type of targeting that was happening. And the guy's name is James Max Paisley. Let's see if I have this handy here. Jerry Max Paisley, described as a hoodlum from Detroit and connected to the Bonanno crime family and something called the Tucson bombings. Okay, so Bonanno goes down and he is trying to retire there in Tucson, Arizona, after living this lavish life of crime as recorded in The Godfather. But he just can't help himself. And he decides, I'm going to control the businesses in Tucson too. And the way that we're going to do it is we're going to bomb them when they don't do what we say. And so there's this weird wave of bombing in the mid-60s. In Tucson, Arizona.
Tucson?
Yes.
Wow.
I didn't think about this.
How is this not common knowledge?
Well, this Jerry Max Paisley shows up in this story. Let's get to know Jerry Max Paisley for a moment here. The FBI use him to get information on these bombers. There he is. He will later serve a sentence as for having committed a murder in a hotel, and he was basically a hired hitman. But apparently he gets attack of conscience in the 1990s, and he says some very unusual things. Before I get to his file of what he said here, and I have the whole thing, he says something very unusual. A few things, a few notes here about these bombings. And this is some agents, a report about some FBI agents. Quote, "It is understood from sources in Tucson that someone named Smitherman is completely politically motivated," a Phoenix FBI agent wrote to headquarters. And they're going on about these figures, which we can't get into here. "He's obviously not a friend of the Bureau based on his loose remarks, and the agents have been instructed that while they must deal with him, they must do so at arm's length. Having an agent implicated in a bombing spree was the last thing the FBI needed. Hoover, who enjoyed decades of respect as the man who built the world's top law enforcement agency, was under siege and widely regarded as too old for the job." Now, this is very interesting. We're getting into the late 60s. Hoover's getting old. He's getting sloppy. And what happens is one of his FBI agents, who becomes aware of these bombing campaigns, asks, when they have some dirt on one of the people who did the bombings, asks him to commit a bombing of one of the people of Bonanno and one of his agents. This is a very weird story. So because he did this, the FBI is trying to get out of this. And they're trying to figure out, how do we handle this situation where one of our agents instructed this guy to basically bomb the source of the bombings? In December 1971, note the year, a front page New York Times article summarized his problems. Quote, "House Majority Leader Hale Boggs has condemned FBI's Gestapo tactics of spying on American documents that had been stolen in a burglary at an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania. Special Agent John Shaw has been forced out for mild criticism of Hoover, and the cost of the new Hoover building, FBI headquarters, was spiraling upward. Hoover, the New York Times said, is near the end of the line. 4 months later, at 77, he died unexpectedly in his bedroom. If Hoover had drawn a curtain around this affair, which is called the Hale Affair, and we will get into this in another episode, and it has to do with these bombings and how this FBI agent got involved with it. But for our purposes, the presence of Paisley is the first flash that's important to us here. Okay, so I think that's probably enough of that. But there's also another book in relation to this. In his 1999 autobiography, Bound by Honor, Bill Bonanno, who's the son of Joe Bonanno, said he fired the blast that struck one of the two bombers who hit his father's house. He recalled Hale, the man they implicated, as a rogue cop skirting the Constitution in a climate to eliminate evil. He was a lunatic, not a civil servant, Bonanno wrote. So this chapter is going to become very important in a minute here as we go along. but let me summarize it. We have Jerry Max Paisley working in a bar, and the Bonanos come in, and the Bonanos, he's supposed to be retiring, Joe Bonanno, but instead he decides, I'm going to take over Tucson. He starts bombing these places. The FBI is examining it, and they send out an agent named Hale to manage the situation. J. Edgar Hoover is sloppy in this. He's not doing the right oversight. Hale gets one of the bombers. They have some dirt on him, and they say, you work for Bonanno, you bombed one of these establishments, here's what you can do for us. You're going to bomb Bonanno's house as a message back to him to stop this. So this was a very sloppy thing to do. Hale Boggs was catching wind of a lot of these things that were happening. And he was saying, what kind of techniques are the FBI using? Not only are they doing this wiretapping, but now they're bombing criminals. So he's stepping into this. Now, strangely enough, this person who was involved in giving information around this case and later would wind up in prison, in the mid-90s, gives some strange testimony about the Boggs plane disappearance. That's him again, Jerry Max Paisley. The story would come out in the Seattle Times Weekly again. That was the story as it first came out. Later, the story was removed. So this thing exists as a PDF, but you can't get it on the site anymore. In that story, they go into this very unusual story, and John Walczak comes up again. We read some of his stuff earlier, and he does some research about this kind of mafia bomber, hitman, named Jerry Max Paisley. Now, what's interesting is he has a lot of good information. I don't think he has the whole picture of what was taking place there, but he's just getting this wild stuff, and they put out this article. Now, as a result of all this, there are records that the Seattle Times got that I referenced earlier. And some of those records are in here in this file. So I'm going to read a couple of these to you, and then we're going to move along to your questions. I'm going to remind you that you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is the Deep State Plane Crashes episode, X83, and we're looking at this kind of flights to nowhere, Hale Boggs in 1972. Now, the name of the file, they list Thomas Hale Boggs as a victim, Nicholas Begich, of course, as a victim, Russell Brown, and Don Johns, who I believe was the pilot. Now, the official record is 10/16/72, a 310 Cessna aircraft carrying U.S. House Majority Leader Thomas Hale Boggs, also known as Hale Boggs, from the state of Louisiana, and U.S. Representative Nicholas Joseph Begich. Russell L. Brown and the pilot Donnie Johns were reported missing in flight from Anchorage, Alaska to Juneau, Alaska. The aircraft took off from Anchorage at 9:12 a.m. This is the morning that they left, and was scheduled to arrive at 12:30. The twin-engine Cessna aircraft owned by Alaska Airways, Fairbanks, Alaska, was reported to have had 6 hours of fuel. No shortage of fuel there. No word has been received from the aircraft after it took off from Anchorage, Alaska. A massive search conducted by the Coast Guard Rescue Coordinator Center, and so on. That's the official story. And they go down. And this is the official record, and it's pretty thick because there's over 30 pages. But I'm only going to grab a couple that are going to be of interest to us here. Now, somewhere along the line, the investigators get wind that there's this prisoner talking about the murder of Hale Boggs, or the plane, the disappearance of the plane. Wiley Thompson, special agent in charge of the FBI, Anchorage, Alaska, attaches an interdepartment memorandum and related to an interview transcription. Of possible interest to your office is professed involvement in suspicious activities surrounding the Begich Boggs aircraft disappearance, October 16th, 1972. To my knowledge, the Alaska State Troopers have never before received information suggesting criminal actions in the disappearance. I'm not certain at this time if we'll undertake a criminal investigation considering the credibility. After all, this guy's a hitman, and he's a known hitman and a liar, and so on. I would, however, offer this statement for information should the federal government have a pending investigation that has prosed the circumstances surrounding the disappearance. And what he does is he gives them his interrogation of this person who was volunteering information. And again, it's that same character, Jerry Max Paisley. So on 11/8/1994, investigator blank and detective blank, I'm just going to call them Jones, from the Anchorage Police Department, accompanied an FBI agent to interview an inmate who had expressed desire to clear up several unsolved homicides in Alaska. Provided information concerning his involvement and knowledge of 3 homicides. He further discussed his possible involvement in suspicious activity that may have contributed to the Begich Boggs aircraft disappearance on October 16, 1972, in which the wreckage of the missing Cessna 310 was never recovered. Remember, the plane disappeared, the bodies disappeared. No one knows what happened to it. In September 1972, blank transported a suitcase to Anchorage, Alaska at the request of blank, delivered the locked suitcase to blank at Anchorage Airport in the presence of blank. And afterwards, the person he handed the suitcase to told him that it contained a high-tech bomb. Now, what's interesting here is basically Paisley is a low-level figure in Tucson that the Bonanno family adopt to do little errands for them. And what he's saying is, in 1994, if he's to be trusted, that in this period in 1972, he was given a briefcase and said to deliver it from Tucson to Anchorage. And he would, in fact, end up doing this. And when he gave it to 2 of the Bonanno associates who took it, he recognized them. And they only told him something big is going to happen. And they didn't say what it was. But then when he didn't hear of any explosions or anything, he thought, huh. But then later he heard about the plane disappearance and basically put 2 and 2 together. So he goes on further, and what's happening is it seems like the readout that I get is that he's kind of having an attack of conscience, and he wants to get this off of his chest, and he realizes he's not asking for any special treatment except to be taken out of the part of the prison that he's in because he doesn't want retribution from the Bonanno forces. There are people who suggested that he put this on the record for the Bonanno forces, and I'll explain that. Basically, the idea is that there was maybe a case that was being looked into and they wanted to create confusion about it. But in any case, it could be exactly as he said it. Let's read a little bit of it. So they ask him, why don't you tell us what's on your mind? And he swears a lot in this transcript, so it's going to be hard, but I'm just going to jump to the good stuff. He goes, there's certain things that I don't know why things went the way they did. I was just pretty much on what they call in those days, there's 2 eras of my life. There's 2 parts of my life. There's the era before drugs and the era after drugs. This is Jerry Max Paisley talking from prison to FBI agents in Anchorage, Alaska, policemen. Before drugs, I was basically just a effing thug, okay? Known as a guy to do things. If you wanted something done, you come and see me. So it was right for me. If it was right for me, I'd do it for you. Sometimes without money, sometimes I'd charge. Why wait for a favor later? You owe me. Okay, so he's talking about kind of a mafia code. Remember, he's described as a low-level thug because he comes out of the Purple Gang in Detroit, And he's not like a big level mobster. He's just somebody that gets used once in a while. And as a matter of fact, his official prerogative was just owning a bar in Tucson. I did a lot of that down here. I think my record shows that because I've had this not this conversation, but I've had conversations with people that are in and out of the game or been retired for years. This is interesting. Now he's saying he's had deep conversations with people on the mob front, been in and out of conversations. Can we go back in the records and see that, you can always go back in the records and see that I was a doing things kind of guy. For some pretty big people at one time, big people wanted me to do things for them. Sometimes I was taken advantage of. Sometimes I took advantage. I don't know why things, sometimes, I don't know. I can't put it all together. I just don't know what happened and walked away, So this is the kind of meandering conversation that he's giving them. He's leading up to something and they're like, what's going on here? And then he says, clearing his throat, Hale Boggs and Nick Begich. Hale Boggs was God. He was a big man. He was Speaker of the House. Speaker of the House, or just been into it with the FBI and all that. He's just been harassing the FBI pretty bad, doing something against them. I don't know what. But I remembered it was something to do with him and the feds. There's a guy here in town called Blank. You know of him, so a known criminal. They call him the Blank. I'm thinking The Godfather, but it doesn't say that. He's on the outs with him, though. A lot of people don't know that. A lot of people suspect that. A lot of people think that. But he was the guy here in town, okay? Yeah, he came to me one time, and I'm hanging out on the trail, Spanish Trail. And, I'm going to tell you this, but I don't think we can go anywhere with it, But I am going to say this. If we do decide to go someplace with it, you guys got to give me a hand. He's going to give them something very important here. Don't throw me out there to the wolves or no effing wolves or nothing. I don't see how we can possibly go anywhere with it. Anyway, he came to me and I'm at the trail, okay? The Spanish Trail Motel, one of the biggest at that time. One of the biggest in town. My friends own it. They had pretty much run the joint in those days. Like I say, it was before drugs. And when I say the run of the place, if you wanted a room, spend the night, wanted to bring someone, well, he says wanted to bring a broad and come see it.
Say it with an accent. You can do it.
I'm trying not to overdo the.
Go for it.
We want your cooperation. Mm-hmm. For one night, for a friend of his who says, a favor for the old man is what he said, okay? No problem, man. I got him a room. He said, well, I'll meet you down here tomorrow afternoon. So the next afternoon, he met me. I gave him the key to the room. He said, take a ride with me to the airport. We drove to the airport, okay? Well, I hate to tell you this stuff, Blank, but I'm gonna just tell you, okay? Okay, they say. He just goes inside the airport. I'm sitting in the car, okay? He came out with, okay, he got in the car. He introduced me to Blank. We went back to the hotel. What year would this have been? 1972. Summer. We went back to the hotel, and I gave this woman a key to the room. She took her bag. She just had one bag, went in there. I had my room there, too. So he goes round and round talking about meeting these people at an airport, coming back. They have this woman with them. He goes into this hotel. Then the guy says to him, why don't you have dinner with us tonight? I said, sure, So he picks this woman up at 8 o'clock and comes to Kontiki. It's a Polynesian joint here in town. Okay, I called her about 7:30. I'm supposed to pick you up at Baya Bada Bing. Okay. I'll be ready. So I go and I pick her up. We drive to Kontiki. We went in there. There's Blank, okay? I'm thinking The Godfather, but okay. It says Blank. I went to the table. We all went to the table, the four of us. We sat there. We ate. We ordered what we ate. Now, Blank was not my buddy. he's not a type of guy I hang around with or nothing, but I knew the old man. Okay, I knew him from blank, redacted. The girl, I had to go to California to San Francisco, and he asked me, he sent word for me to pick up his wife, take her and drive her to San Francisco, which was sort of like, how those Dagos are. I mean, they don't just throw anybody in their car with their wives.
Mm.
You know what I mean? Especially, mother and children. So I'm the one that took blank to San Francisco. Anyway, he's there and he gives me the old BS, as he always does. Oh, you're a good boy. You're a good boy. You looked out for blank. He gives me all this stuff, okay? We had dinner there and we ate. After dinner, blank gives me the sign. We went to the bar. We had a few drinks, me and him, sitting there, and basically I sensed right away what it was. It was just to get me away from the table. But I didn't question him. And he goes on. We did a little dancing and drinking, stuff like that. About 2 weeks after, Blanks came to me and says, you want to take a trip? Okay, for the old man, for us. He said, for us. So I said, sure. He said, all right. He says, meet me down here. He gave me a certain time to meet him. He says, don't pack a bag. Just bring a suit. Travel light. Because you're going to be gone one night, maybe two. He was just explicit about this for me, not to bring a suitcase. Okay, bring a suit bag. So I took just a suit bag with a couple of pair of underwear in there, a pair of socks, one change. He picked me up and he drove me to the airport. He gave me a one-way ticket to Alaska. I've never been to Alaska. He said, blank is going to meet you at the airport, okay? Okay, now I knew that he knew blank. Because, blank used to come to the Jester's Court all the time. He was hanging out over there and everybody liked that. I've never seen blank, never came in there to my knowledge. I got on the plane. Oh, when he drove up there, he gave me the suitcase and the key to it. He said, here, don't even open this. I'm not sure how to blank that one out. Effer. Just take it to blank. He'll meet you at the airport. He meets me at the effing airport when I get off the plane to Alaska. I'd never been there before. Blank is with him, okay? And he went to some effing, it wasn't a hotel, it's like an apartment. That's where I spent the night. Okay, and I went and gave him the suitcase. That's all I know. Later on, though, blank tells me when I get up there, I went back. This must have been, I'm going to say, September 72. But then I went back in April of 73. And me and blank got real tight. Okay, so the person who, this godfather sends him on this errand from Tucson to Anchorage. And when he lands there, he recognizes one of the guys basically as part of this Banana gang, even though he's not saying. I mean, he told them, but they're not telling us. And so he transports this briefcase, and then he gives it. And they say to him, don't open it, whatever you do. Then he gives it to this guy, and they take it. And then he's on his way back. And about a year later, he sees this guy, and he says he becomes tight with him, the guy he handed the briefcase to. Presumably, he didn't really know him well before. Okay, I hung out with blank for a little while, and there's a chef's inn and all that stuff. Me and blank got real tight. Told me later that it was an effing bomb. And a high-tech bomb, Now, I don't know if he was just BSing me. But when did that plane go down? When did it go down? It went down in October of 72. I don't know who put it on there. I don't even know if I was being BS'd, if I was being lied to. I sort of feel I was being told the truth. Well, when did I know that? I'm not saying blank ever had this done, I don't know. I don't know what the effing story was. I know that it was something I wanted to know, but I didn't want to dwell too much on it. But it was. Now, who was it that told you that this high-tech bomb was that? Was it blank that told you that? Or this is the agent asking him a question.
Mhm.
Then he said, see, I've never heard of him in years. I have no idea where he's even at. He's a real low profile. He didn't get into drugs with us. He stayed out of the drugs. Question, do you know where he's at now or anything? Answer, I heard he's in Anchorage. Still there. Still in Anchorage. I heard he's out there, but I don't know for sure. And at a certain point, he said, you know, when I look at this, I mean, that would be so effing heavy. I mean, that's like, you know, killing the president, for Christ's sake, you know. Well, yeah, if it's even true. I do know this. I know I kept the suitcase. I know I had the key, and I never opened it. In fact, I just carried it to the counter. They took it. When I got off the baggage, picked it up, and blank took the effing bag, you know. So I never opened it. But I wouldn't have done that anyway. I didn't know what was in it. I knew it wasn't drugs, though. And so the conversation goes on, but in essence, he reiterates. But what we have is this weird mafia low-level thug, and he is giving all this information to the FBI. This thug would pass away in 2010 in his late 60s. And when I look into his history, it's very peculiar, but his story is very unusual. And you can see it's quite a bombshell. One thing I want to point out here is that Paisley is someone who basically got bagged for being a hitman, but he got on the radar, first of all, in these strange Tucson bombings. This is what happened. And there's more to his story, but for our purposes right this second, what I want to point out is his story in essence is that for this godfather in Tucson from the Bonanno family, he carried a briefcase to Anchorage and handed it off to operatives who then later told him it was a bomb that they carried and that it was the bomb that was placed on the Cessna plane that Hale Boggs was on. This is a fact, yes.
Shamanis Anamkara, who is asking the same question. I was thinking, how did he know it wasn't drugs? Any idea?
Well, he's a kind of operative who probably would have known how those things were transported. He knew that
or how heavy it, who knows, you know.
I mean, it's interesting that they had him just carrying a bomb in a briefcase.
Mm-hmm. Well, and if it was a bomb, you know, would there have been any survivors?
Well, the bomb may have exploded and taken the plane down, but they may have survived after the fact. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a few twists, wild twists, but I want to kind of just reiterate, this is the person, Jerry Max Paisley, who gave that testimony. And he was very wrapped up with the Bonanno Mafia. So his testimony is that the Bonannos instructed him to take a bomb to Anchorage to hand it to Mafia operatives, who then later confirmed to him that they put it on the Boggs plane. This is the kind of bombshell story that's been hiding under the surface with this. Now, there are weirder tracks to this. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go for this track right now. Let's take a look at this person. Does he look familiar? It's Jimmy Hoffa. Who's back? You got a break, Jimmy Hoffa. And his, of course, this is the Teamster leader.
Vigorous speech.
It's pretty good. He had an incredibly hostile relationship with Bobby Kennedy, who outed him and ultimately got him indicted into prison after 3 tries. And what happens is that President Nixon will pardon Hoffa. Now, what I found is that Hoffa, when he gets out, goes to the Bonanno family and tries to form a liaison with them, probably to get back to the Teamsters and run things the way that he did. I think it's quite possible, and this part is not on the record, but it's something, a dot that I've connected in the middle of all of this, that the Hale Boggs assassination could have been carried out by the Bonanno family as some kind of a deal with forces connected to the Nixon administration as a way to get Boggs out of the way so that they could, in turn, the favor that they would grant to the Bonannos was getting Hoffa out of prison. Now, whether that was Nixon himself or just the deep state aspect around his administration, we'll never know. But it's clear that the Bonannos, for some reason, according to this guy's story, were behind this putting the bomb in the plane. So, in summary, there's a few things that prove this might even go further. And this part is so dramatic, but it looks like the Bonannos targeted Begich's family. So the tentacles of this thing run quite deep. And when we look at it that way, we're really seeing that the Bonannos, for some reason, had this fixation to get in there and to make this happen, to secure the idea that they could take Boggs out. Now, Boggs was that much of a player and had threatened the FBI that much that he basically, he was in the crosshairs of the deep state to that extent. And remember, the deep state has an aspect which is entirely mafia connected. Let's not forget the tentacles of Richard Helms running all the assassination programs in Latin America using what? The mafia. And the CIA using the mafia, trying to whack out their enemies internally inside the United States and abroad. This is the thing that the CIA got called out for in the 70s. So therefore, we're starting to see the underbelly of that deep state movement. And there's more to this story, so I'm going to bring it up. But since we're getting into time here, I'm going to ask Vasilivia to take the floor with the questions.
Okay, Jason Turner, did Boggs have evidence against Hoover, such as video evidence?
Well, what he was claiming was that he had evidence that the FBI, it was interesting too, because he would say that they're bugging senators and congressmen. And then he talked about how he was being bugged. But he was very aware that he had accused the FBI directly of bugging him initially, that they could sue him for libel or whatever it would happen to be. But they were also very, very nervous about him. Later, towards this period, by the time he goes down on the plane, he is seething with wanting to get rid of Hoover and get them out. And I think when we look at this period where he's trying to really shake out the corruption, we have to take the progression this way, which is he's heading towards being Speaker of the House. He's the majority leader. If he is Speaker of the House, none of the kind of deals with the Nixon administration are going to work. And so they're not going to get off easy. So what happens is that scenario that I outlined earlier, which is that Ford becomes the VP, gets appointed VP after Agnew gets taken out for bribes. But if Boggs knew about the bribery around Agnew and he knew about the Watergate scandals, which it sounded like he did before they were actually full on in the news. Remember, the Watergate break-in happens in June of '72, but Nixon wins that election because the Watergate story doesn't really break against him until later. And so he wins the election with over 60% of the vote. So he creams McGovern. So there's no problem there. But the fear of not getting the second term is what drove so many of the things that they did with Watergate. eventually the Watergate scandal goes back to the presidency. So if Boggs had that information, that would have been absolutely detrimental if they thought they could contain it. But what's interesting is that Boggs was talking about having explosive information, not only relating to this other big thing, but to the JFK assassination. So we have now this interface of him bringing forward what? CIA involvement in the JFK assassination and CIA involvement in the Watergate break-in. This is the crisscross that's going on there. And it's funny, when I mentioned Dorothy Hunt, she was saying to her husband, E. Howard Hunt, who was the CIA spy master who was working for both Nixon and the CIA undercover, he leads up this whole team. So one thing I want to cap this all off with, and there's more to this story. There's more explosions. So there's more explosions about Paisley, which is probably not a good way to put it. But there's more kind of big pieces to come out about him. Before we go any further, I want to introduce this person, and then we're going to go to your questions. How are you doing out there, Mrs. Begich?
Doing great. Everybody's got lots of questions for you.
I can tell that, this one, there's a lot of TKOs in this one. So it's pretty explosive information about what happened to Boggs and, as a result, what happened to Begich, because he was with Boggs. And I do think it's one of these deep state situations where they just could not tolerate his presence any further. Now, I mentioned that Robert Ludlum in the Matteries Circle is the name of the novel. In 1979, he comes out with it. And Ludlum has this ability to tap into sources and then draw stories out of them. And this is a novel, but it has that kind of reality bent to it. And in that story, Boggs is trying to get the truth about the JFK assassination out and gets assassinated himself in that novel. I believe this is how this played out. And remember, he was going to be third in line for the presidency. If Agnew and Nixon were going to be taken out, he would have ascended to the presidency just by succession, which would have been highly unusual, but that was the nature of the situation we're in. The Los Angeles Star reported Boggs had revelations on Watergate and the Kennedy assassination in their newspaper. That's one of many sources that mention this. And also that the crash happened just a couple weeks before the election. I think that's important also. And now what's weird, there's a weird story hanging out in all this also, which is, there's so many in this. The records, when the family went to get the records on the survivors after the fact, they got stonewalled and they said the records were destroyed. Later, Mark Begich, who is the son of Nick Begich Sr., he gets a package on his porch. And the package on the porch has all the original documents with no redactions about the survivors, the plane going down, the sources that I was reading to you. He gets it all. Some anonymous delivery person leaves it for him. One other strange intrigue is that our friend, Mark Begich, who would beat Ted Stevens for the Senate, Ted Stevens was under indictment for accepting bribes. Now, Ted Stevens is going to show up very interestingly in the Dark Journalists show right here, because Ted Stevens is one of the three people involved with setting up ATIP, along with Daniel Inouye and Harry Reid. But what happens to Ted Stevens?
It's not good.
He goes down in a plane crash. So
when does that happen?
I believe it's somewhere around 2010. Mm-hmm. And what's odd is this, that Mike Gravel, who's also a senator from Alaska, his wife goes down in a plane crash. So there's some mechanism on overdrive in relation to deep state politics. But in Alaska, my God, this method is certainly on overdrive there. Now, I think the fact that those records resurfaced showed clearly that there were survivors, and for some reason that trail is left off, and they didn't want to reveal it at the time. And we don't know what happened to the plane or the survivors. That's the fact.
Could you talk a little bit more about that package that was left? When did that happen, and what kind of investigation did they do after the fact?
No, they had the records, and they were able to raise hell with the FBI because they had the actual records. But there's not much more to it than that, because they brought it to the point where they could, and there's still so many aspects of the case that are completely unknown. So it is quite remarkable.
It's amazing that the media, this is a juicy story.
It is.
Why are they not reporting on these suspicious murders?
It is. It is. Well, I think that at a certain point we can rely on the media to assist in the whitewash, and this is the nature of the thing. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is episode X83. We're going to rush to your questions now to get everybody in. It's fantastic crowd tonight, and we're going to try to get as many of your questions in as possible. And I have one other thing that I can read, but you go first.
Okay, so Dash Rendar, how did the Mafia go after the rest of Boggs' family? Is it
Yes.
Boggs or Begich?
Boggs? It's both, actually,
okay.
But what it turns out, if you go deeper into that story, and we only have so much time tonight, I want to go deeper into it, but there's no question that this Paisley tried to target the family himself by getting close to the family. And that's a whole other
You might as well go into it.
I will, actually. Before I get out of this, I want to get into Eagle Crow. This is Eagle Crow.
Is that his code name?
No.
That's his name?
Yeah.
Okay.
There might be different pronunciation. It's EGILKROGH, but it's Eagle Crow. He's a very unusual operative for the Nixon administration. This is him heading to prison with his wife by his side. And Eagle Crow is a very interesting player. He is the person who set up the Plumbers, which is an intelligence unit run out of the White House, which is what caused Watergate, because they did the Watergate break-in and it was traced back to the White House through the Plumbers. And one of the key people in the Plumbers was Hunt, and Hunt's wife was the one who went down in the plane crash. So we're connecting all the dots. This is where it leads us. But Eagle Crow is particularly interesting because he comes in through John Ehrlichman, and Ehrlichman, serving in the Nixon administration, gives him this mission of setting up the Plumbers unit. Now, in January of 1973, right after the crash of Hale Boggs, or the disappearance of the plane, and after the plane crash of Dorothy Hunt, Eagle Crow is suddenly installed as the Undersecretary of Transportation. In this position, he has control over the NTSB and the FAA. And both of those investigations into those plane crashes say we couldn't determine what was the cause of it, and he's able to cover it up. He and his role in association with setting up the Plumbers will get sentenced to 6 years in prison for doing that, because he orchestrated the burglary of a Beverly Hills psychiatrist to get Daniel Ellsberg files. But he'll only serve 4 months of that sentence. And Eagle Crow will come out and give speeches and all the rest of it, and he'll write a book about how he introduced Elvis to Nixon, and that's how Elvis got his famous
God, they rely on our short memories, right?
It's amazing, isn't it?
Wow.
So he's quite an interesting character. and he is the one who set up the burglarizing of Dr. Fielding's office. I do want to say this, that becoming the undersecretary, he's in that position to whitewash. And his nickname is Bud, by the way, if you're looking around for information on him. November 30th, 1973. Remember, he's installed in January of 73. He's a short-termer for the Undersecretary of Transportation. November 30th, 1973, he pleads guilty and goes to jail over Watergate. Now, I said he was sentenced to 6 years in prison. How do you get out in 4 months? That's pretty remarkable, let's face it. I mean, how does this happen? Well, he was pardoned. He got a presidential pardon. His nickname was Evil Crow. So I think what we have here is a deep state tactic operated out of the Undersecretary of Undersecretary of Transportation office, covering up for the FAA and the NTSB. And Crow, who's on the record committing crimes, burglarizing the office of this Beverly Hills psychiatrist looking for dirt on Daniel Ellsberg, who had released the Pentagon Papers in 1970 that had shown that the Vietnam War that they had sold the public was largely a myth constructed by the Central Intelligence Agency and the Pentagon. He is the guy who gets in charge of those 2 plane crashes, and that's why all the records go into oblivion. That's the story. And this is really kind of the crucial web in all of this. And I think through all those threads, we see that Hale Boggs was very important, and that had he got his way as leader of the House and Speaker of the House, he would have been part of really dissecting the Watergate scandal, and we would have been then in a period of resetting our national priorities in the sense of constitutional justice. Instead, we got Ford and Rockefeller, who appointed Bush as the leader of the CIA. And then you got Bush piggybacking into the Reagan administration. So there is the kind of the whole outline of this case. And it looks like the Bonanno family were the ones in the deep state aspect who were instructed and given the call there to commit the assassination. So quite remarkable under any circumstances, Miss Olivia.
Okay, David Termina. DJ, can you explain that Bill Clinton connection again?
Yeah, it's not very deep. It's just unusual that Hale Boggs, when he's on his way to Anchorage, is coming out of a political event in Texas.
Okay, wait, to his death.
Yes.
To his demise.
Yes.
Okay.
And he is leaving Texas to go to Alaska. And the political activist who's trying to get into the game here is an Arkansas law student named Bill Clinton. And he's the one who drives Hale Boggs to the airport. So it's just an interesting chapter in history. I mean, when I first heard that, my mouth dropped, because just think about it. Bill Clinton, who becomes the president, who becomes governor of Arkansas for 2 terms, who runs the Clinton Foundation, and we get through Hillary Clinton and all the rest of it. If you bring it all down to it, his first kind of key place where he shows up on the radar is driving Hale Boggs off to this trip where Hale Boggs will disappear into history. It's pretty interesting. There's no doubt about it.
He's being trusted to get him there.
He is. He doesn't do anything himself.
He's playing his own little part.
Yes, he's
in the drama, in the play.
He's definitely transporting the cargo, as it were. But I think that's an interesting snapshot there of just, he happened to be the one that took him there. It's quite unusual. So, yeah, I mean, we don't know if Clinton had any knowledge or if he's just being a delivery boy, but more than likely he's just driving him there, but it's odd.
But somebody had him do that.
Yes.
He was assigned that job.
He was.
And
it's pretty
probably
unusual.
Promoted based on his success.
Well, when we look at here's what people need to understand when they look at the Clintons. And you have to understand Mena, Arkansas. They do all this other stuff with the Clintons, and they talk about, well, you know, they did this and they did that. Look at Mena, Arkansas. Mena, Arkansas was the airport in Arkansas where the Contras laundered cocaine into the country that became the crack cocaine epidemic in the late 80s and 90s. Bill Clinton was the governor. George W. Bush was the person who ran the Contras and the operation with Oliver North. And Oliver North, by the way, is the one who set up all these emergency plans that they're talking about, like continuity of government. And like, so we have to be very careful about when they use emergency powers. But Oliver North got caught up in the Iran-Contra scandal, as we know. Those are the guys, Bush and Ollie North, who run the drugs out of the Contras into the country. And so the CIA, this whole corridor of the CIA bringing drugs into the country, this is what was going on with the Contras in the 80s. That's where the whole Dark Alliance story from Gary Webb comes from, because he tracked the story and he's the one who found out that it was the CIA running drugs into Mena, Arkansas. And that's where the whole Barry Seal thing came out. You know, Tom Cruise did a movie recently about Barry Seal, and they didn't really mention the CIA. That's like talking about The Wizard of Oz without mentioning the Wicked Witch. I mean,
well, this is their new MO, is they make movies because they know that's what kids are going to watch. That's going to be history. That's
yes.
what they'll, and so that becomes the official story.
What was the name of the Gary Webb movie again?
Shoot the Messenger?
Shoot the Messenger, yeah. That is actually worthwhile. And Peter Dale Scott, actually, Professor Scott was a consultant on that. But the Clinton aspect of running the corruption of the drug money from the Contras through and working with the federal level at that shows you where the Clintons were coming from really early. Another weird thing is that Hillary Clinton volunteered as a lawyer on the Watergate Committee. So we really have... Okay, Miss Olivia, I'm sorry, go to your questions.
I'm going to go straight to this. Scott Frangos, yes, Mena corruption is mega and well documented, so how do they get away with it? I want to address that question.
Oh, well, they got away with it. The Iran-Contra scandal almost tripped them up, and it got certain people lined up with sentences like Caspar Weinberger, but he was pardoned by Bush, and this is how it works, you see. Just like our friend Eagle Crow was pardoned after only 4 months. What they do is they take them aside and say, look, it's going to be hard. You're going to be in there, but we'll try to take it easy. We'll give you a kind of a country club prison experience. And you'll come out, you know, we'll pardon you when the heat is off. And that's really how they did it. But we know the Contra story. And there were some people prosecuted around it. They just never prosecuted the main bullseyes, which were the Central Intelligence Agency, Clinton and Bush. I mean, they were the ones who orchestrated it along with Ollie North. And what we got are some low-level people, you know. I'm trying to think of the guy's name, Ricky Ross, who was the big drug dealer that really revolutionized, you know, and made drug dealing of crack in LA like this incredible. He was like the quantum drug dealer. And all of that was all Contra money and Contra drugs. And this was their way of supporting this Contra insurgency in Central America. So that's a whole deep track to this. But it is, if you want to go Clinton, you got to go Mena.
Well, I think what we're realizing here is that the government is run like the Mafia.
Yes.
That really is the truth.
Well, Catherine Austin Fitts is trying to tell us that for how long. And I will also say that there's definitely a Mafia connection on all sides there, but the Trump part has a big Mafia connections for Roy Cohn, because you can't build in New York without deep Mafia ties. That's just the way it goes. But you really can't run casinos without Mafia ties. And so it's a factor there, but it is something that I think we need to understand. It doesn't disqualify, you know, they all deal with Mafia money, but it's something for us to know that we have to deal with it. Yes.
Okay, so Aether, what role did X-Protect play, if any, in the plane crashes of Senator Wellstone and Boggs? Were any of the plane crash victims visited by the men in black beforehand? Let's go into that a little bit more.
Well, we saw that Boggs, they try to run him off the road.
Exactly.
I believe that this was a warning to him. I think if they wanted to get him, they would have got him there. This was his first shot across the bow. That could have been an actual attempt, and he may have just survived. But it's 1970 when that happens. Now, although we look at it in retrospect, we don't understand something, that in the early 70s, they hadn't had Watergate yet. And they hadn't had all the investigations, the reinvestigations into the Kennedy assassination, which happened in 73, 75, and then the House Assassinations Committee is 77 to 79. And they have all these other ones in between, like the Church Committee that uncovers the fact that the CIA is using, heart attack guns, and that they're assassinating foreign leaders, and that they're running drugs. And so they kind of pin in the CIA for a little while there. It all comes out through these committees. But before that, Boggs is operating in an era before all that comes out. So he's ringing the alarm bell. These guys are breaking the Constitution, and he is becoming aware that the CIA was involved in the Kennedy assassination. He's pressing this message out. Remember that the way that Nixon was able to send his aides to blackmail Richard Helms to not say certain things about Watergate was to send them over there to say, if you open that up, Nixon's going to open up the Bay of Pigs thing. The Bay of Pig thing was a shorthand that they used to describe the CIA's role in the Kennedy assassination. That's what his own aides have said in their biographies and books after the fact. So this is what he would do. They would get into a tight spot, and the CIA would be inclined to help those people getting rid of Nixon because he was beyond their control at that point. And he would send his aides over. And this was one aide, Bob Haldeman, who goes over there and gives him the same spiel and says, if you go forward with this investigation, the old man, which they called Nixon, is going to bring up the whole Bay of Pigs thing. And he said that Richard Helms, who's like the real cool as a cucumber CIA director, jumps up on his desk and becomes red-faced furious and beats on his desk and says, "We had nothing to do with that. We had nothing to do with that," and freaks out. And he said, "I couldn't believe it," because Haldeman was just a messenger boy in this. And here he has the director of the CIA, who's like Mr. Ice in his veins, freaking out, eyes bulging, red face, the way he describes it. That's the level of blackmail back and forth that's going on with these people. And it's pretty dirty business. That's why when you get dirty players in there, you think of somebody like Nixon or whatever. He knew how to play the game because he had been in it so long. 8 years as VP. He had seen that corruption growing, and he had kind of been in league with parts of it. But at a certain point, he thought, I'm the president. I've done all this stuff. I've opened China. I'm going to be able to run things the way I want to. And the deep state says, not so fast. And that's how you remove Nixon from office, because he was removed for things, only because he was against certain things that the CIA wanted. And he, in fact, fired Helms in 1973. So there you go, firing CIA directors. You do that and you get ousted. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, Najat Madri, does DJ think Bill Clinton was groomed from a young age to be a deep state operative? Remember the picture of Bill with JFK?
That's really true. I've always thought that Clinton's story, like Obama's story, was unusual. There is a CIA agent who was really deeply involved in the Kennedy assassination named Cord Meyer. And he bragged to a Republican fundraiser that they owned Clinton since college. So they do have these programs where they can really identify people who will help them move their agenda down the road. And I think part of that is degenerated when they try to roll out people like, Pete Buttigieg or whatever. They seem to operate a little bit better before. Nowadays, they're taking pretty low-hanging fruit. But it is pretty interesting, actually, the way that they manipulate political figures along the way. And no doubt in the press, the CIA can make or break a career just because they can give you those leads. Just ask, Bob Woodward, for example. But in politics, they, they represent like a power wing, which is why it's so important to understand Professor Scott's American Deep State work, and the fact that Professor Scott puts forward that the CIA represents factions, and that they were founded by Wall Street lawyers. Alan Dulles was an S&C Wall Street lawyer. That's their faction. It's connected to that kind of machinery. And the only way to really clean it out is to address the CIA part head on. Absolutely. Yes.
Ronan returns. Question, was Clinton's training for intelligence operations in England at college? More than likely.
Well, he was a Rhodes Scholar. We know that. What's interesting, and it came up during the election, is that he went to Russia for a period of time when Russia was under Soviet control, and he didn't want that on his passport. And then someone broke in and saw his passport. Just like we've never been able to see Obama's passport. And just for people who, want to think deep outside the box here, speaking of deep state plane crashes, the person who was the Health and Human Services Secretary in Hawaii who confirmed Obama's birth certificate went down in a plane crash. So that
pretty soon after.
Pretty soon after. I've always thought that was very unusual timing, and that it's tragic, but also when we look at this pattern, it's like, wow, it really, you really start to think about this. And when I was looking into some of the people that were associated with this business that I was talking about earlier, with the Bonanno family handing off this briefcase, one of the persons who was identified by Paisley as receiving the briefcase, if you look and find his history out, you'll find that he was in a gunfight in the 90s, a shootout with a cabbie, and that the cabbie never got charged for shooting him. So I always thought that was weird, so there were all these kind of techniques, I guess, that they use. But the plane crash aspect is just overwhelming. Yes.
I just wanted to bring this up. Carl Jung mentioned Michael Hastings was exposing Hillary, ended up driving over 100 miles per hour, then exploding like JFK Jr.'s plane. The CIA can easily take down anybody whom is not helping the deep state.
Well, I think that they are motivated when somebody, it's that whole thing about being over the target. What happens is, that's a big story about Hastings, because he had exposed corruption inside the Pentagon in relation to what was happening with the generals in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And he was working on a drug story related to the CIA when that happened to him. Now, that story, anyone who reads it, his car is over here and his motor's over there. So that something unusual took place. It wasn't a normal car accident. That's an explosion, and just the timing was too perfect on that, but it was also a warning to those people. Now remember, in that period, Cheryl Atkinson, who does all these kind of independent reporting things now, she worked for CBS, and her laptop, the Obama administration tried to use the 1917 espionage rule on her, and they bugged her laptop, and she took them to court. And they wanted to prosecute her for releasing information about the Obama administration and gun running and other things. So, these programs are very alive and well. The way that we get our hands on them is to understand their history. And, when we see these things rolling out, how do you get accountability from the government? And again, remember, the government is not a monolith. You have a lot of middle managers in there who just want to get by. But what Professor Scott refers to as the deep state, when it steps in for a policy change, they shake the world upside down. They get their things done, and then they withdraw. And they leave all these people with the debris of what they've done. And those people put together the whitewashes and stuff, because if it's either that or take on the deep state. And I think it's important I want to take just 60 seconds to establish something about the deep state. which is there's a lot of talk online about the deep state, and you'll hear things that are so uninformed, I can't believe it. One of the things that I hear often is that, Trump, well, this is a new one that came out, that the coronavirus was a way to eliminate the deep state in Iran. Before that, it was bombing Iran, bombing targets of the deep state in Iran. Let me explain something to people who say these types of things. The deep state resides as a system inside of America. That's the reason it's a deep state. You can't bomb a deep state. If it was a public state, you could bomb it. The deep state is the deep state. What does it consist of? It consists of what Professor Scott has told us, who coined the term, told us what it was. It was intelligence agencies, organized crime, and then the contracting agencies that work for the intelligence agencies, and then the agencies that handle managing enormous wealth. That is the core of the deep state. How are you going to bomb a target in Iran and say you're bombing the deep state? Whenever they do this stuff, it's in that milieu, and it comes out a lot in the Q junk, where they say, don't worry about it. Trump's going after Iran because the deep state is there. No, the deep state wants to bomb Iran. You have to get the psychology straight. This is just misinformation. So, get it from the source. Professor Scott identified what the deep state was. Let's not see it as just a buzzword in a YouTube video by someone who doesn't understand anything. It is something that Professor Scott learned over 4 decades about how it works. Read his book, Cocaine Politics. Read Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. These are the things that give us that foundation. And we don't have that foundation. You hear people just saying, hey, it's good to bomb Iran because you're getting at the deep state. No, the deep state is fueled by warfare, arms manufacturing, drug running. That's what the deep state is about. You don't get anywhere by bombing people. So, let's get the definitions straight, and then we'll have a better time understanding these things. I also think there's a very strong possibility that there's a layer, like a mountain, really, of disinformation that gets flooded into the alternative side. So you'll have people misidentifying things that are important to identify correctly, like the deep state. So when you hear easygoing stuff about, hey, let's go bomb the deep state in Iran, and Trump is trying to bomb targets in Iran, that's crazy. It has nothing to do with anything. The deep state is a system that exists underneath the public state in America. And the point is, the public state, the overt state, needs to get at the covert state and get some kind of constitutional balance reestablished, because when you don't, you can have the covert state remove people like your president and stage things like false flags and all the rest of it. That's the point of it. So let's make sure we get the definitions right. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, David Termine again. DJ, do you think it's possible that Trump, desperate to save his presidency, might decide to release information about these assassinations so we can move forward somehow?
Well, I wanted to think that about Trump, but when I saw that he had the mandate on October 26, 2017, from a 1992 congressional act, the JFK Secrets Act, Records Act, to release it. And it's a law. So the fact that he didn't do it tells me that he wasn't serious about that, or he decided that he didn't want to hold off. He didn't want to let that information out, that he wanted to hold off. So we're in a kind of a problem state with the perception of Trump versus what he's actually done. And it's tricky because, the alternative is so much worse, the Clinton forces and this crazy Biden candidacy and all that. But I have to say on the record, Trump hasn't done anything about 5G vaccines. His cabinet is loaded with more Goldman Sachs people than Bush and Obama combined. That's a fact on the record. So how are you going to get away from the swamp when you have that many swamp creatures in it? At the same time, you can give Trump credit for certain things, for identifying certain things. And obviously, if he was that much of a target of the intelligence agencies when he got in, he's a threat. And if they're pulling impeachment every, 20 minutes, every time they have a new thing to get rid of Trump. So, we can't say that. What it is, we have to understand that there are different factions in that deep state duking it out. And the Trump faction is a different faction. But on the Trump side, there's not a great respect for the rule of law either. So I always say it's either, the Trump gang gets their act together, it's going to be a third alternative that we're going to have to turn to. Yes.
We're going to have to occupy the Fed,
Well,
the audit is not enough. We're going to have to we're going to need protests. I think that's what it comes down to. I mean, it's all about money and control and power.
That's true.
So we actually have to look at that system, the banking system, if we're really going to target anything that may have a weakness.
Well, it's been over and over. This is the thing. This is one of the really kind of interesting points, I think, that Dr. Begich made on the show on Tuesday, which is he said, it's a dead tree and they keep throwing different types of decorations on it. But what they need is a new foundation. And this is the problem. We keep reanimating this kind of stock market system, which can be easily and fraudulently, especially with quantum computing, they can create any kind of scenario that they want. So I think that we really do need new solutions. And we can't be wrapped up in this idea of Trump, the Messiah thing. If that's not working, then you're just going to have to go into a third alternative looking for the right thing. And this is what Robert Kennedy said after John Kennedy was assassinated and LBJ took over as president, and he knew LBJ was corrupt. And he said, well, we're just going to have to kind of form our own government here among us, do our best to actualize it, and I think that's what it comes down to. Yes. Olivia, we got two more questions.
Okay. Hostbean says Berman Supreme in 2020. Remember Berman Supreme?
Berman. Yeah. I'll tell you, they have to do better. The libertarian ticket, they're set up in every state. So, and I have a lot of ideas about how to make that work. The independent party, the independent vote work in a way that wouldn't be just an afterthought, like a Ralph Nader type problem. It could be something, which could really influence those elections. And we'll talk about that more. I want to remind everyone to go to the Dark Journalist website now, and darkjournalist.com. That is where you can sign up for our newsletter. And we're really, in this stage where they're throwing everyone off social media. So we really have to kind of get it in gear and develop this pipeline of communication. And what can happen there is we'll send you an email about once a week to let you know what shows are coming up and what topics are going to be covered and the amazing guests that we have coming up for you this spring. And while you're there, support the show, get behind it, subscribe to the show. We've made it very affordable so everyone can get on board and get behind the show, make sure it comes your way, and support the important work that we're doing. We're going to take two more questions and then we're out. Yes. Okay.
Well, LJ Motoman, do you think the deep state will try to take out Trump?
Well, I think that they already have on a number of occasions. And I think that they try to remove him even before he got in. And the Steele dossier and this kind of conspiracy among the FBI hierarchy and then the CIA people like John Brennan, who has his own connection to TTSA, by the way, the drone king himself. These are the people in that deep state who didn't want to have to deal with an upstart situation. I think the problem is that the faction that has been supporting Trump is too hell-bent. They have that neocon bent to go into the Middle East again, and that's Bush playbook stuff. And they really want to do it in relation to Iran. They've been after Iran. And as Fitz said, they feel like they have President Trump until January 20th at least of 2021. So they want him to do this while they have him, because they're not sure, even though the election might look good for him now, what could go down. Yes.
I love this question. A cult fan. Are these souls like Dag, who is a personal hero, reincarnating from life to life in order to further the great work? What is the goal? Is this similar to esoteric schools?
Well, it's very interesting. That's a very esoteric question. Here's an esoteric answer. If you go and search out the Casey readings, you'll find that he identified that Alexander the Great was Thomas Jefferson. So obviously they are kind of reanimating these patterns in life after life. So when you go into that understanding and the cosmology around reincarnation, there's a lot of mystery school information that this is a thread where they pick it up life after life. So I'll tell you, when you look at the leadership ability in the 60s with JFK and MLK and RFK, that's the kind of leadership you need to transform a society. And we all have that in us. We have the ability to make this decade of the 2020s like that. So I hope that we do. I think what we've been seeing is this older system dying off, but fighting with incredible powers and exceptional technology, but they don't have any ideas, and their people don't seem to really stand for much. And I think when we get someone who at least speaks their mind like Trump, it was refreshing in the campaign to bring these things out. But I worry with the Trump administration that if they fall for the war with Iran stuff, if they have neocons in their ear, we'll wind up in a worse situation than even under Bush, because at least Bush, he went after Iraq. He didn't go after Iran. Iran is a country with almost 100 million people. And it's no cakewalk, and even with Iraq, it took us 20 years to even try to get out of Afghanistan. And even with Iraq, we still have 5,000 troops there that are taking hits, So what are you going to do? Be policemen of the world forever? That's not a plan. So this old neocon plan of taking over the Middle East, they still have it on deck, and they've had some interruptions along the way, but those people still want it. And I think that they will try to use Trump to get it. So Trump, I think, has gone sideways on a number of things. And I think that he has been the best of a bunch of weak alternatives. And but ultimately, I think we need either for that administration to really improve and really get back to what they got elected for, or we need a third alternative. The fact is, ultimately, we need a third option. Yes. One more.
I know for me that if I have to reincarnate, I'm already setting myself up now to reincarnate into a bloodline that has a lot of power and impact. I'm just I'm putting it out
That's
there.
not interesting.
Because I will be in a position of knowing what they're up to. And if my heart stays pure, I can create a revolution from within that bloodline. So, and I invite anybody else out there who has a similar bent to join me on this quest.
You already have a powerful bloodline.
Well, no, you know what I'm saying.
No.
All right, so
okay,
I love this last question.
Yes.
What's in our sky? Please ask DJ, do you think Trump will use the Nixon time capsule to get reelected? Wouldn't that be awesome?
Listen here. The truth is that we brought forward that information on this show. It came from Robert Merritt, who was from the Houston plan, and it came via the Watergate lawyer, Douglas Caddy, giving us more information about that. So Trump and his connection to his uncle, which he mentioned just recently, his uncle was an engineer at MIT who was the protege of Vannevar Bush, and Vannevar Bush, as we know, was the head of the UFO file. So therefore, John Trump, having been called in to inspect Tesla's work when Tesla died, and also having that connection with the UFO file, it's pretty off the charts. So he's got some connection there. And that's something I've been working on with with Dr. Farrell, which is what is the real thrust of the UFO file in the Trump administration? And it's coming pretty clear. I can tell you this. Trump's got a lot of deep info. And he knows a lot about the UFO file, but he made a big mistake when he said that space should be a warfighting domain. And that is against what America is set up to do in space. And so I think that, again, he's got to organize. He has to get away from the war stuff and organize it into just strength. Strength is different from war. And so I think it is interesting. However, in terms of his access, yeah, you bet. Wow, incredible questions tonight. What a riveting show. I could go on. There's so much more
Can I let
information.
Najat have the last word?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, she said this episode is better than any thriller movie. I love it.
We're certainly getting there. There's so much more. I might have to do a part 2 on this one because there's a lot more details about these plane crashes, and also about all the players in this, Boggs and Begich and all the rest. And so we'll be coming back to you next week. And thanks so much for joining us, Harry Hockinen. It's great to see you out there, David Donaway. And a cult fan, always great, fantastic. Gigi Young joined us. Thank you so much. Kate, it's great to see you. Tuggy Waffles, I'm not familiar with that name, but I'm going to get familiar. Pippi Bernstein. Stefan, it's great to see you out there. Firestorm, wow. Fantastic people. Griffin Eagle, Najat, thanks so much. Breach, excellent to see you. We will see everyone.
Hold on, I got people to thank.
Yes.
Okay, James Belch, Ann Elizabeth, Big Papa Pump, A Cult Fan, Eurythmy is Fun, Good Things, Mott, Eric Ackerley, Flood, and Charles Marlowe. Thank you so much for your super chats.
Wow, remarkable. Thank you so much. And that's incredible. I have to say that when you get behind the show, it makes a huge difference, and we really appreciate it. We will be back with you next week, and we'll see you on Friday for X Series episode 84. And we're going deep. And Miss Olivia, how would you like to round it up?
Let's eat.
That's great. Everyone, Modwiz, fantastic to see you out there. Pippi Bernstein, fantastic, excellent, great crowd tonight, and we'll be back at you next week. Thanks so much. Have a fantastic weekend, of course, and try to get away from all that crazy Corona talk.
Right. Have a movie fest. Right.
Yes.
Because it's far better to escape into a happy fantasy land than to worry too much, right? Because worrying isn't good for your immune system either. Right? We all have to stay healthy.
That's true. That's true.
You probably have enough information already to, be informed for you and your family. So if you have to stay inside, don't addictively look at what's happening out there, the chaos, other people worrying. You're just going to feed the negativity.
No doubt about it. No doubt. Someone said Wizard of Oz out there, and I salute you.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to mention, that's a great point, and it's important to stay very calm. I want to remind everyone to go and watch the interview with Nick Begich.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to salute the Begich and Boggs family for having gone through that crisis of dealing with that. It's quite remarkable when you go into the history of it. So we definitely appreciate that kind of transparency that they've given. And we will see you all next week. Now it says end broadcast, but as you know, it never really ends.
Mm-hmm.
And have a great weekend, everyone.
Okay. Take care. Have a wonderful week. Stay safe. Stay calm. Stay centered.
Stay sane.
Stay sane.
Say what you mean.
And don't let them win.
But who is them? That's it.
We all know.
It's great to see you. And I should salute Carly and Groovy Bean, even though they're not out there tonight. Thank you so much. And we will see you next week.
Bye, everybody.